My husband took me to a Michelin-starred restaurant to meet his most important business partner. He leaned across the table and offered me to this stranger for the night, whispering the vile arrangement in Spanish. He assumed I was just his uneducated housewife who did not understand a single word. 20 minutes later, his jaw dropped when he realized he had just dug his own grave. My name is Vanessa. I am 33 years old, and for 6 years, I played the role of a quiet, obedient wife to a high-powered Manhattan financial director. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic partner who completely underestimated your worth. The clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of wealthy patrons filled the private dining room of one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants. My husband Derek sat beside me in his tailored Italian suit, radiating a nervous energy that he tried to mask with arrogance. Across from us sat Matteo, an influential venture capitalist from Madrid. Derek was sweating through his expensive cologne, desperate to secure a $5 million bridge loan to save his struggling hedge fund. I sat quietly wearing the modest black dress Derek had picked out for me, playing the supportive spouse to perfection. Matteo swirled his vintage wine, looking at Derek with a raised eyebrow. The negotiation was not going well, and Derek was getting desperate. A greedy, calculating smile spread across my husband's face. He glanced at me, patted my hand condescendingly, and then looked right at his investor. Esta noche ella es tuya, Derek muttered in fluent Spanish. Consider it a down payment on the $5 million capital call. My breath caught in my throat. My own husband had just offered me to another man to cover his financial mess. He was trading my dignity for a business deal right in front of my face. A cold wave of shock washed over me, followed immediately by a burning, intense rage. But I kept my face perfectly still. I picked up my fork and carefully cut a piece of my steak. Derek smirked, fully believing I was completely oblivious. To him, I was just a simple freelance digital illustrator who spent her days doodling on an iPad. He thought my world was small and entirely dependent on his paycheck. Vanessa is a homebody, Derek announced in English, noticing Matteo staring at me like a piece of meat. She has a cute little digital art hobby. It keeps her busy while I handle the real work. I opened my mouth to ask the waiter for more sparkling water, but Derek instantly cut me off. My wife will just have tap water, he instructed the waiter sharply. He turned to Matteo and chuckled. You have to manage their expectations right. If I do not control the budget, she would spend my entire bonus on drawing tablets. She relies on me for everything. I take care of her so she does not have to worry her pretty little head about adult problems. I forced down a sip of water, letting the cold liquid ground me. Derek was painting me as a financial burden, a charity case he graciously supported. He had spent our entire marriage making me feel small, making sure his wealthy family knew he was the sole provider. What he did not know was that my cute little digital art hobby had evolved into a massive digital education and animation corporation. I was secretly running a media empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but I had kept my name off the public records to protect my peace from his status-obsessed family. Matteo nodded his eyes, raking over my body with disgusting entitlement. He clearly accepted Derek's twisted down payment. Underneath the heavy white tablecloth, I felt Matteo's hand slide onto my thigh. His fingers gripped my knee, squeezing it possessively, as if finalizing a transaction. I did not scream. I did not cry. I calmly placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. The heavy oak chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. Derek shot me a furious, warning glare. Sit down, Vanessa, you are embarrassing me. We are in the middle of an important meeting. I ignored my husband and looked directly into Matteo's eyes. In flawless high society Spanish, with a sharp Madrid accent, I spoke loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. I am not cheap enough to bridge the $5 million black hole your fraud has created. And you can take your hands off my skin before I have the state district attorney look into your investment fund. Matteo choked on his wine, coughing violently as the dark red liquid splashed all over his crisp white shirt. He scrambled backward in his chair, knocking over his water glass in sheer panic. Derek's face lost all its color, turning a sickening shade of gray. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. The arrogant financial director had completely short-circuited. "You speak Spanish." Derek finally managed to whisper, his voice trembling with a panic I had never heard before. "I speak a lot of things you know nothing about," I replied in icy English. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a heavy metal card. It was an unactivated American Express Centurion black card, the ultimate symbol of elite wealth. I dropped the heavy metal card right onto Derek's dinner plate. It landed with a loud, satisfying thud against the fine porcelain, echoing in the suddenly quiet dining room. "Manager," I called out firmly. The restaurant manager rushed over immediately, looking nervously at the spilled wine in Derek's pale face. "Charge the entire $4,000 bill for this table to my account," I instructed, pointing to the black card. "These two gentlemen are finished." I did not wait for a response. I did not look back at my husband's horrified face or his sleazy business partner. I simply grabbed my clutch, turned my back on the men who thought they could buy and sell me, and walked out of the restaurant into the cool New York night. I pushed my heavy oak chair back and stood up with perfect posture. Diego smiled a greasy, confident smirk, fully expecting me to excuse myself to the restroom so they could finalize their disgusting transaction. Preston did not even bother to look up from his phone, completely indifferent to the fact that another man had just violated my physical space. I looked down at Diego. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. In flawless high society Spanish with a sharp Madrid accent that cut through the ambient noise of the dining room, I delivered my verdict. "I am not cheap enough to bridge the $5 million black hole your fraud has created. And you can take your hands off my skin before I have the state district attorney look into your investment fund." Diego gasped sharply. He choked on his vintage Cabernet, violently coughing as the dark red liquid sprayed across his crisp white shirt and the pristine tablecloth. He scrambled backward in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute panic as he knocked over a crystal water glass. The glass shattered against the floor, causing several nearby patrons to turn their heads. Preston dropped his phone. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He stared at me with his mouth slightly open, completely paralyzed. The arrogant financial director who loved to belittle my intelligence had just short-circuited. "You speak Spanish?" Preston whispered, his voice trembling with a level of terror I had never heard from him. "I speak a lot of things you know nothing about," I replied, switching back to icy English. I opened my designer clutch. I did not pull out a tissue to wipe away tears, because there were none. Instead, I retrieved a heavy metal card. It was an authentic American Express Centurion black card. The ultimate symbol of elite wealth, a card offered by invitation only to individuals with massive liquid assets. I had kept it unactivated in my wallet for emergencies. Tonight was an emergency. I dropped the heavy metal card directly onto Preston's dinner plate. It landed with a loud, satisfying clatter against the fine porcelain. "Manager," I called out firmly. The restaurant manager rushed over immediately, looking nervously at the spilled wine, the shattered glass, and my husband's terrified face. "Charge the entire $4,000 bill for this table to my account," I instructed, pointing to the black card. "These two gentlemen are finished eating." I did not wait for the manager to process the shock. I turned my back on the men who thought they could buy and sell me and walked straight out of the restaurant. The cool New York rain was falling as I stepped onto the pavement, but I felt nothing but absolute clarity. I raised my hand, and a black car pulled up immediately. I got in and gave the driver the address to the luxury brownstone Preston and I shared. During the 20-minute ride across the city, I did not shed a single tear. For 6 years, I had endured Preston's condescension. He had constantly reminded me that I was a financial burden, a woman who contributed nothing to his pristine corporate image. He had forced me to sign a ruthless prenuptial agreement a week before our wedding, ensuring I would leave with absolutely nothing if our marriage failed. He thought that prenuptial agreement was a leash. He had no idea it was actually my shield. Because the agreement stated that all assets acquired independently remained separate property, He had completely isolated himself from the media empire I had built in secret. When I unlocked the front door of the brownstone, the house was quiet and dark. I walked directly upstairs to the master bedroom, pulled my large suitcase from the closet, and began throwing my clothes inside. I moved with cold efficiency, packing only what I needed. I left behind the expensive jewelry Preston had bought me. I left behind the designer dresses he had chosen to make me look like the perfect compliant wife. I only packed the things that belonged to the real me. 10 minutes later, the front door downstairs slammed open with enough force to shake the walls. Heavy, aggressive footsteps pounded up the hardwood stairs. Preston burst into the master bedroom, dripping wet from the rain, his tailored suit ruined, and his corporate mask entirely shattered. He did not look apologetic. He looked furious. He slammed the bedroom door behind him and locked it, leaning against the wood to block my exit. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Preston screamed, his face red with rage. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Diego pulled out of the deal. He walked away. "He is threatening to report my firm. You just ruined my entire career." I continued folding a sweater and placed it neatly into my suitcase. "I did not ruin your career, Preston. Your illegal offshore accounts and your wire fraud ruined your career. I simply refuse to be the collateral damage." Preston lunged forward, grabbing a stack of my clothes from the bed and throwing them onto the floor. "You are not going anywhere," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You owe me. You have been eating my food, living in my multi-million-dollar house, and spending my money for 6 years. I gave you a life you could never have afforded on your own. You owe me this." Sleeping with Diego was the only way to secure that bridge loan. It was the only way to save this family. I looked at the clothes he had thrown on the floor. Then I looked him dead in the eye. "Save this family or save yourself from a federal indictment?" I asked sharply. "Do not pretend you care about us. You were perfectly willing to prostitute your own wife to cover up your felony. You think because you pay the mortgage, you own my body." "You are my wife!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are supposed to have my back. I am facing 10 years in federal prison if the authorities look into my ledgers." Diego was willing to overlook the missing funds and supply the capital. All you had to do was keep him happy for one night. One night to save everything we have. I zipped my suitcase shut, the metallic sound cutting through his frantic shouting. "We do not have anything, Preston. We have a mountain of debt, a fraudulent hedge fund, and a marriage built on a ruthless prenuptial agreement you forced me to sign. You wanted separate finances. You wanted to make sure I could never touch your precious corporate money. Congratulations! You got exactly what you wanted. Your debts are entirely your own." Preston sneered, his expression twisting into something ugly and cruel. "You think you are so smart with your little Spanish trick and your fake metal credit card. Where did you even get a fake Centurion card? You think you can survive out there without me. You have no real job. Your digital drawings are worthless. I will freeze the joint accounts right now. I will cancel your phone plan. I will leave you on the street with absolutely nothing." He pulled his phone from his wet pocket, frantically opening his banking app to cut off my access. He was desperate to regain control, desperate to put me back in the box he had built for me. He thought the threat of poverty would make me fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness. He thought I would crumble without his financial protection. But I just stood there watching him scramble to freeze accounts that I had not touched in years. I had my own accounts. I had my own corporation. I had enough liquid capital to buy his failing hedge fund 10 times over. And as he frantically tapped on his screen trying to destroy my life, the sound of the front door opening downstairs echoed through the quiet house. Heavy, confident footsteps began ascending the stairs, and I knew immediately that the situation was about to escalate into absolute chaos. The heavy, confident footsteps ascending the stairs did not belong to the police or the building security. I knew that distinct, sharp click of designer heels against the hardwood floors. It was Sylvia. My mother-in-law had demanded a spare key to our luxury brownstone the day we moved in, and she had never once respected the concept of boundaries. Preston stopped frantically tapping on his phone. The color rushed back into his pale face as his mother appeared in the bedroom doorway. Sylvia stood there dripping wet from the New York rain, holding a soaking designer umbrella. She took one look at my open suitcase, the clothes scattered across the floor, and her son's ruined custom suit. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask why I was packing. She immediately assessed the situation and chose her side just as she always did. "What is going on here?" Sylvia demanded, her sharp eyes darting between us. "Preston, why is Diego calling your father in a blind rage saying the investment deal is completely dead?" Preston pointed a shaking finger at me, playing the ultimate victim. "She ruined it, Mom. She humiliated Diego in the middle of the restaurant. She started speaking Spanish and caused a massive scene. Diego walked away. The $5 million bridge loan is gone. The feds are going to subpoena my corporate ledgers by Monday morning. I am facing a federal wire fraud indictment and she refuses to help me fix it." Sylvia turned her cold, piercing gaze toward me. She dropped her umbrella on the pristine hardwood floor, marched across the room, and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed in the high-ceilinged bedroom. The sting radiated across my skin, burning hot and fast. But I did not raise my hand to touch my face. I did not step back. I did not blink. I just stared at her, letting the absolute silence stretch between us. "You selfish little brat," Sylvia hissed, stepping closer so I could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "A loyal wife does whatever it takes to save her husband's career. You have been eating his food and living in his house for 6 years. Your pathetic little cartoon drawings do not pay for this brownstone. You will unpack that suitcase right now. You will get on your knees, apologize to Preston, and then you will march over to Diego's hotel and fix this deal tonight." I looked at the woman who had made my life a living nightmare since the day I met her son. "You want me to sleep with an investor to cover up your son's felony?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You want me to prostitute myself so Preston does not go to federal prison for hiding offshore funds in shell corporations?" "It is the least you can do!" Sylvia snapped, her face contorted with elitist rage. "You brought absolutely no assets to this family. You are a financial parasite. Preston gave you a life of luxury, and this is how you repay him. By abandoning him when he makes a minor business miscalculation. Trash always returns to the gutter." I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that made Sylvia involuntarily take a half step backward. "I remember the day of our wedding, Sylvia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I remember you walking into the bridal suite while I was getting my hair done. You picked up my Regional Graphic Design Award, the one I was so proud of, and you dropped it straight into the trash can. You told me my family was a collection of lower-middle-class nobodies, and that I should be on my hands and knees thanking Preston for rescuing me from a life of mediocrity. You thought you broke my spirit that day. You thought you established the pecking order." Preston scoffed, stepping out from behind his mother's shadow. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his dominant corporate persona. "Stop living in the past, Jocelyn. You are walking out of here with nothing. I just froze the joint accounts. Every dollar you think you have is tied to my name. You have no credit score of your own. You do not own this house. I forced you to sign that prenuptial agreement specifically to protect my wealth from your greedy hands." He crossed his arms, laughing maliciously as he stared at my small suitcase. "Go ahead. Walk out into the rain. Within 24 hours, I will file a police report claiming you stole family assets if you take that laptop. You will be homeless, begging me to take you back by tomorrow morning." I looked at my sleek silver laptop resting on top of my neatly folded clothes. I reached out and carefully zipped the suitcase shut. Then I grabbed the laptop and tucked it under my arm. "I did not open this suitcase to take your money, Preston," I said quietly. "I packed it to leave your debt behind. That prenuptial agreement you forced me to sign was the greatest gift you ever gave me. You insisted that all assets acquired independently remained entirely separate property. You wanted to make sure I could never touch your corporate bonuses. But you were so arrogant you never considered that I might acquire assets of my own. You completely isolated yourself from my wealth." Preston frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What wealth? You draw digital cartoons for pennies." I ignored his ignorance and walked over to the smart home security panel mounted near the bedroom door. I had spent 3 weeks wiring and programming the entire automation grid for this brownstone because Preston was too cheap to hire a professional firm. He had told me my digital skills were finally good for some free household labor. I tapped the glowing screen, entering a custom override sequence I had programmed deep into the source code. The panel beeped twice, flashing a bright red warning light. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded, lunging forward. "I am revoking your administrative access," I replied, hitting the final enter key. "I just disabled your fingerprint recognition and your mobile app control. The heating, the security locks, and the lighting grid are now entirely locked under my encrypted master password. You can enjoy the dark." The lights in the master bedroom immediately powered down, plunging Preston and Sylvia into sudden pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the street lamps outside, shining faintly through the rain-streaked windows. I heard Sylvia gasp in shock, and Preston curse loudly as he bumped into the heavy oak dresser trying to navigate the dark room. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and walked out of the bedroom, leaving them stumbling in the shadows of the luxury home they thought they controlled. I descended the stairs and stepped out the front door into the cold New York rain. I did not feel homeless or defeated. I felt like a predator finally released from a very small cage. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person in Preston's extended family who had the legal brilliance and the moral compass to help me execute the next phase of my plan. I called Kendrick, my sister's husband, and the most ruthless corporate defense attorney in Manhattan. The heavy, confident footsteps ascending the stairs did not belong to the police or the building security. I knew that distinct, sharp click of expensive heels against the hardwood floors. It was a sound I had been conditioned to dread for the past 6 years. Sylvia, my mother-in-law, had demanded a spare key to our luxury brownstone the very day we moved in. She had never once respected the concept of boundaries, treating our home as an extension of her own absolute authority. Preston stopped, frantically tapping on his phone. The color rushed back into his pale, panicked face as his mother appeared in the bedroom doorway. Sylvia stood there, dripping wet from the relentless New York rain, holding a soaking wet designer umbrella. Even at 62 years old, she carried herself with the terrifying posture of a woman who was entirely accustomed to destroying people who got in her way. She took one look at my open Rimowa suitcase, the clothes scattered across the expensive Persian rug, and her son's ruined custom suit. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not ask why I was packing my belongings in the middle of the night. She immediately assessed the situation and chose her side just as she always did. "What is going on here?" Sylvia demanded, her sharp eyes darting between us. "Preston, why is Diego calling your father in a blind rage? He is screaming that the investment deal is completely dead and that you humiliated him." Preston pointed a shaking finger at me, playing the ultimate victim. His corporate facade was entirely gone, replaced by the whiny, entitled boy Sylvia had raised. "She ruined it, Mom. She humiliated Diego in the middle of the restaurant. She started speaking fluent Spanish and caused a massive scene. Diego walked away. The $5 million bridge loan is gone. The authorities are going to subpoena my corporate ledgers by Monday morning. I am facing a federal wire fraud indictment, and she refuses to help me fix it." Sylvia turned her cold, piercing gaze toward me. The ambient light from the street lamps outside caught the furious glint in her eyes. She dropped her heavy umbrella onto the pristine hardwood floor, marched across the bedroom, and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed in the high-ceilinged bedroom. The physical force of the blow snapped my head to the side. The sting radiated across my skin, burning hot and fast, leaving a bright red mark on my cheek. But I did not raise my hand to touch my face. I did not step back. I did not shed a single tear. I just slowly turned my head back and stared at her, letting the absolute dead silence stretch between us. "You selfish little brat," Sylvia hissed, stepping closer so I could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "A loyal wife does whatever it takes to save her husband's career. You have been eating his food and living in his house for 6 years. Your pathetic little cartoon drawings do not pay the mortgage for this brownstone. You will unpack that suitcase right now. You will get on your knees, apologize to Preston, and then you will march over to Diego's hotel and fix this deal by tomorrow morning." I looked at the woman who had made my life a living nightmare since the day I met her son. She genuinely believed she owned me. She believed my body was just another asset in her family's corporate portfolio. You want me to sleep with a corrupt investor to cover up your son's felony? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. You want me to prostitute myself so Preston does not go to federal prison for hiding offshore funds in shell corporations? It is the absolute least you can do! Sylvia snapped, her face contorted with elitist rage. You brought zero assets to this family. You are a financial parasite. Preston rescued you from a life of mediocrity. He gave you a life of luxury, and this is how you repay him, by abandoning him when he makes a minor business miscalculation. You owe him everything. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that made Sylvia involuntarily take a half-step backward. I did not look like the compliant, submissive daughter-in-law she had bullied for years. I remember the morning of my wedding, Sylvia, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I remember you walking into the bridal suite while I was getting my hair done. I had brought my regional graphic design award and placed it on the vanity because it was the first real piece of professional validation I had ever received. You walked in, looked at it with absolute disgust, picked it up and threw it straight into the trash can. Sylvia lifted her chin, refusing to back down. It was cheap plastic. It was an embarrassment. You told me my family was a collection of lower middle-class parasites. I continued, my words cutting through the room like shattered glass. You told me I should be on my hands and knees thanking God that I was allowed to marry into your pristine bloodline. You spent 6 years treating me like a charity case, like a prop, to make your son look like a generous savior. You thought you broke my spirit that day. You thought you established the pecking order. Preston scoffed, stepping out from behind his mother's shadow. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain his dominant corporate persona, fueled by his mother's aggressive support. Stop living in the past, Jocelyn. My mother is right. You are walking out of here with nothing. I just froze the joint accounts. You have no credit score of your own. You do not own this house. I forced you to sign that prenuptial agreement specifically to protect my wealth from your greedy hands. I looked back and forth between the two of them. They were united in their cruelty, united in their complete lack of morality. Sylvia had raised a man who viewed human beings as commodities, and she was perfectly willing to sacrifice me to protect her family's public image. She had always viewed my silence as weakness. She had always assumed my patience was just quiet desperation. For 6 years, I bore the emotional weight of Preston's financial recklessness. I watched him gamble away his clients' money, while Sylvia cheered him on, calling him a financial genius. I sat quietly at country club dinners, while Sylvia mocked my career choices to her wealthy friends. I endured the constant psychological abuse, the subtle insults, and the blatant disrespect because I wanted to believe my marriage could survive it. But the slap across my face, combined with Preston's horrific betrayal, severed the final invisible thread tying me to this toxic family. You think my digital drawings do not pay the bills? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think I am just a parasite feeding off your son's crumbling empire? Sylvia crossed her arms, her designer jewelry clinking together. You are nothing without the name I allowed you to take. I reached down and grabbed my sleek silver laptop from the bed. I did not pack it to steal from them. I packed it because it was the central hub to a corporate media empire that generated more daily revenue than Preston's entire fraudulent hedge fund made in a year. They thought they had cornered a helpless victim in this bedroom. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who possessed the financial firepower to legally and systematically dismantle their entire lives. I stood on the wet pavement of the Upper East Side, letting the cold rain wash over me. My cheek still burned with the searing heat of Sylvia's hand. The physical sting was fading, but the absolute clarity it brought remained. I held my phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing as I waited for Kendrick to answer. It was past 1 in the morning, but I knew my brother-in-law would be awake. Kendrick was a senior partner at one of Manhattan's most ruthless corporate defense firms, and he practically lived in his office. He answered on the 4th ring, his deep voice thick with focus as he reviewed late-night case files. I told him I needed his help right now. He heard the cold, sharp edge in my voice, and immediately told me to come straight to his building in Midtown. I hailed a passing cab and slid into the leather back seat, resting my silver laptop carefully on my knees. As the city lights blurred past the rain-streaked window, I thought about Kendrick. He was an incredibly sharp African-American man who had married my sister Beatrice 5 years ago. Preston and Sylvia had always treated Kendrick with a sickening brand of subtle racist condescension. They smiled to his face at their lavish Thanksgiving dinners, but whispered behind his back, dismissing his elite Ivy League credentials and viewing him as an outsider who had somehow infiltrated their pristine bloodline. Kendrick and I were the two outcasts of this toxic family. Tonight, the outcasts were going to burn their empire to the ground. The security guard in the lobby recognized me and swiped me through the turnstiles with a polite nod. I rode the glass elevator to the 42nd floor. Kendrick was waiting for me by the reception desk. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened after a grueling day of corporate negotiations. When he saw me stepping out of the elevator dripping wet with a suitcase in one hand and a laptop in the other, his professional demeanor instantly shifted to deep protective concern. He took the heavy suitcase from my grip and guided me into his expansive corner office overlooking the city. He sat me down on a plush leather sofa and handed me a dry towel from his private washroom. Then his eyes locked onto the bright red welt spreading across my left cheek. His jaw tightened instantly, and the friendly brother-in-law vanished, replaced entirely by the ferocious attorney. "Who did that?" Kendrick asked, his voice dangerously low. "Sylvia," I replied, wiping the rain from my forehead. "She let herself into the brownstone with her spare key right after I walked out of the restaurant. She demanded I go to Diego's hotel room and finish the transaction to save her son's career. When I refused, she slapped me." Kendrick let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in sheer disgust. He sat in the armchair across from me, pulling a yellow legal pad onto his lap. "Tell me exactly what happened from the beginning," he instructed, his pen ready. I opened my phone and accessed my cloud-synced voice memos. Before we even sat down for dinner, I had suspected Preston was going to try something manipulative regarding our personal finances. I had quietly activated the recording app on my phone and slipped it into the breast pocket of my suit jacket before checking my coat at the restaurant entrance. I placed the phone on Kendrick's glass coffee table and pressed play. We sat in the quiet office, listening to the clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of the restaurant. Then came Preston's voice, speaking in fluent Spanish, offering me to another man. "Consider it a down payment on the $5 million capital call." Kendrick's eyes darkened. As a corporate defense attorney, he was intimately familiar with the depravity of wealthy, desperate men, but hearing a husband trade his wife as a financial commodity made his blood run cold. He listened as the recording captured my flawless Spanish response, the shattering of glass, and the panicked aftermath. When the recording ended, Kendrick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Preston is not just a terrible husband, Jocelyn. He is a terrified man, standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. A $5 million bridge loan from a foreign venture capitalist is not a standard hedge fund strategy. That is a desperate, off-the-books scramble to inject liquid cash into an account before someone audits it." Kendrick stood up and walked over to his massive dual-monitor workstation. "Let us see what your husband is really hiding." He logged into a secure financial database and began pulling up public disclosure statements and SEC filings for Preston's firm. His fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through complex webs of corporate data. I sat beside him, watching the numbers fill the screen. It took Kendrick less than 20 minutes to connect the dots. He pointed to a series of irregular transfers highlighted in red on his screen. "Look at this routing pattern," he said, tapping the monitor. Preston's hedge fund did not just make a bad bet on the market. They have been actively funneling offshore funds through a series of shell corporations for the past 14 months. They are bleeding capital and covering it up with fake returns. Preston's desperation to appease Diego tonight was not just to save a failing fund. It was a frantic attempt to cover up massive federal wire fraud before the regulatory agencies rip his company apart. Just as Kendrick finished explaining the sheer scale of the felony, my phone vibrated on the desk. It was a barrage of text messages from Preston. He had apparently found a way to manually reboot his phone and use cellular data after I locked him out of the house network. The messages were unhinged and aggressive. "You are dead to me, Jocelyn. My lawyers are drafting divorce papers first thing Monday morning. I am citing mental instability and spousal abandonment. I will make sure the judge gives you nothing. You will be completely homeless." I read the messages aloud to Kendrick. He shook his head, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. "He is trying to intimidate you into silence," Kendrick explained. "He thinks that prenuptial agreement he forced you to sign is an ironclad weapon. He assumes you have no resources to fight a protracted legal battle against his high-priced attorneys." I looked at Kendrick, and a slow, calm smile spread across my face. I reached for my silver laptop resting on the coffee table and opened the lid. The screen illuminated the dark office. "Kendrick," I said softly, "Preston thinks I am a broke freelancer because I let him think that. I let his entire family believe I was a financial parasite because it was the easiest way to keep their greedy hands out of my business. I logged into the secure servers of my holding corporation, bypassing 2 layers of encrypted biometric security. I opened the primary asset ledger for Lingo Smile Media, the digital education and animation empire I had built entirely from scratch over the past 6 years. I turned the laptop around and pushed it across the desk toward Kendrick. Kendrick leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the corporate structure, the global licensing agreements, and finally the verified liquid capital balances resting in the holding accounts. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked from the 9-figure numbers on the screen up to my face, and then back to the screen. "You are the sole owner of Lingo Smile Media," Kendrick asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I nodded, closing the laptop. "Preston thinks he froze my life when he cut off his credit cards tonight. He has no idea that I have enough capital sitting in those accounts to buy his entire fraudulent hedge fund and liquidate it for spare parts." Kendrick sat back in his chair, a slow, brilliant smile forming on his face. The brilliant corporate lawyer realized exactly what kind of firepower we now possessed. "Jocelyn," he said, picking up his legal pad, "let us go hunting." The glowing screens of Kendrick's dual monitors illuminated the dark office as we began to systematically dismantle my husband's entire existence. Kendrick did not just look at the surface-level SEC filings we had pulled up earlier. He dug deeper, using his firm's proprietary legal databases to track every single shell corporation Preston had registered over the past 2 years. As we worked side by side, the atmosphere in the room shifted. This was no longer just a wronged wife seeking a divorce. This was a corporate siege. Kendrick handed me a stack of printed financial disclosures, his eyes scanning the endless rows of redacted numbers. He pointed his pen at a specific LLC registered in the Cayman Islands. Preston thought he was untouchable. Kendrick said, his voice tight with a cold, calculated anger. "He and Sylvia have always operated with this sickening level of entitlement. Do you remember the family retreat in Aspen 3 years ago?" I nodded, keeping my eyes on the documents. How could I forget? Sylvia had rented a massive ski lodge for the entire extended family. She had intentionally assigned Kendrick and my sister Beatrice to the smallest guest room near the garage, claiming it was a booking error. During dinner, Preston had handed Kendrick his empty wine glass and told him to go fetch another bottle from the cellar, treating a brilliant Ivy League-educated attorney like the hired help. They smiled to his face, but their subtle racist condescension was always there, poisoning every interaction. They viewed Kendrick as a token outsider who did not deserve to sit at their pristine mahogany tables. They looked at me and saw a lower middle-class girl who was desperate for their money. Kendrick continued tapping the printed pages. They looked at you and saw a quiet housewife who was too uneducated to understand their brilliant financial maneuvers. They underestimated both of us, Jocelyn. And that arrogance is exactly what is going to send Preston to federal prison. I pulled my silver laptop closer, syncing my secure corporate network with Kendrick's legal database. I needed to see exactly how much debt Preston was drowning in. The deeper we looked, the worse it got. Preston had not just made a few bad trades. He had systematically drained the accounts of his most vulnerable clients to fund his lavish lifestyle. He had bought custom suits, luxury cars, and expensive country club memberships using stolen money. And then the most damning piece of evidence appeared on the screen. Kendrick pulled up a private loan agreement that had been filed just 3 weeks ago. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing as he read the terms. "Look at this," Kendrick said, his voice laced with disbelief. Preston and Sylvia took out a massive predatory line of credit from a shadow lending firm to float the hedge fund. They used their multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate as collateral. I stared at the screen, tracing the digital signature on the loan documents. Sylvia loved that Hamptons estate more than she loved her own son. It was her ultimate status symbol, the place where she hosted her elite summer galas to show off her wealth to the Manhattan high society. The fact that she was willing to leverage her most prized possession meant they were truly desperate. The $5 million bridge loan from Diego was supposed to cover this debt, I said, piecing the puzzle together. Preston was trying to secure Diego's money to pay off the shadow lenders before they foreclosed on the Hamptons estate. That is why he was willing to trade me tonight. He was completely out of options. Kendrick typed rapidly, cross-referencing the lending firm. The company holding this debt is notorious for aggressive collections. If Preston misses his next payment, they will seize the estate immediately. But here is the interesting part. This specific lending firm allows third-party corporate acquisitions of their debt portfolios. They do not care who holds the paper as long as they get their premium up front. I looked at Kendrick, and a dangerous idea began to form in my mind. The kind of idea that would completely obliterate Preston's remaining sanity. "Can Lingo Smile Media buy this specific debt portfolio?" I asked, my voice steady and resolute. "Can my holding corporation purchase the loan and become the primary creditor for Preston and Sylvia?" Kendrick stopped typing. He looked at me, his sharp legal mind instantly processing the magnitude of what I was suggesting. If my corporation owned their debt, I would hold the absolute power to foreclose on the Hamptons estate. I would literally own the roof over Sylvia's head. Kendrick's lips curled into a fierce, triumphant smile. "Jocelyn, if your media corporation has the liquid capital to buy out the loan, we can execute a silent acquisition by sunrise. Preston will not even know the debt has changed hands until we drop the foreclosure notice directly onto his lap." I did not hesitate. I opened my encrypted communication channel and drafted an urgent, high-priority message to my chief financial officer. I instructed him to mobilize our acquisitions team immediately and authorize a complete buyout of the loan portfolio tied to Preston's hedge fund. I authorized the transfer of funds from our reserve accounts, ensuring the transaction would be seamless and untraceable to my personal identity. As I hit send, a profound sense of empowerment washed over me. For 6 years, Preston had used his financial status as a weapon to control me. He had constantly reminded me that I was a parasite living off his charity. He had forced me to sign a prenuptial agreement designed to leave me destitute. He had laughed in my face just hours ago, threatening to freeze my accounts and leave me homeless in the rain. He had no idea that while he was sleeping, I was orchestrating a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover of his entire life. We sat in the quiet law office watching the city begin to wake up through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain had stopped, and a pale gray light was creeping across the Manhattan skyline. We had spent the entire night hunting through the wreckage of my husband's fraudulent empire. We had the recording of his vile arrangement with Diego. We had the evidence of his offshore shell corporations, and by the time the stock market opened, we would officially own his massive family debt. Kendrick closed his files and poured us both a cup of black coffee from his office machine. He handed me a warm mug, his eyes filled with immense respect. "You know," Jocelyn, Kendrick said, taking a sip of his coffee, "Preston is going to wake up today thinking he has the upper hand. He thinks he is going to walk into a divorce lawyer's office and dictate the terms of your surrender. He thinks you are currently crying in a cheap motel, terrified of the future." I looked down at the steaming coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. I thought about the red mark still fading on my cheek from Sylvia's slap. I thought about Preston's arrogant sneer as he told me I was nothing without him. "Let him think he is winning," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Let him enjoy his morning. Because by tonight, he's going to realize that the quiet, uneducated housewife he tried to sell to an investor is actually the woman holding the match that will burn his entire dynasty to ash. The pale gray light creeping across the Manhattan skyline brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. As the city woke up, the screen of my phone lit up with a relentless stream of notifications. Preston had finally realized that his smart home security system was entirely out of his control, and his panic was rapidly mutating into aggressive hostility. He was doing exactly what Kendrick and I knew he would do. He was trying to terrorize me into submission. I sat in the quiet law office sipping the last of my black coffee and read his messages. They came in rapid-fire succession, each one more unhinged and desperate than the last. "My lawyers are drafting the divorce papers right now," Preston wrote. "I am citing severe mental instability and spousal abandonment. You walked out on me during a critical business negotiation. You are having a nervous breakdown, and I am going to make sure the judge sees exactly how erratic you have become. You will not get a single cent from me. I will make sure you are left completely homeless. You are nothing without my name." I read the words and felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no anxiety, no heartbreak, just a cold, clinical satisfaction. Preston was incredibly predictable. He truly believed he was the architect of my reality. He thought his corporate salary was the only thing keeping a roof over my head. He assumed I was currently curled up on a lumpy mattress in a cheap roadside motel, crying over the loss of his precious high society lifestyle. I set my phone face down on the glass table and looked at Kendrick. My brother-in-law was already dressed in a fresh suit, ready for his morning court appearances. He gave me a sharp, confident nod. "Do not answer him," Kendrick advised, packing his briefcase. "Let him spin his wheels. He thinks he is controlling the board, but he does not even realize we changed the game completely. Go to your office, Jocelyn. I will handle the legal filings for the debt acquisition on my end. By the time he figures out what hit him, the ink will already be dry." I thanked Kendrick, grabbed my silver laptop, and took the elevator down to the busy Manhattan streets. I hailed a black car and gave the driver an address in the Flatiron district. As the car navigated through the morning traffic, I watched the city wash away the remnants of the rain. For the first time in 6 years, I was not heading back to a brownstone that felt like a beautifully decorated prison. I was heading to my actual domain. The car pulled up to a towering glass-walled corporate building. It was sleek, modern, and imposing. I stepped out onto the pavement, holding my head high, and walked straight through the revolving glass doors. The main lobby was buzzing with young professionals and seasoned executives carrying briefcases and artisanal coffees. As I approached the private biometric security gates, the head of building security, a broad-shouldered man named David, immediately stepped out from behind his podium. He did not ask for my identification. He did not treat me like a lost housewife wandering into the wrong corporate zone. He stood up perfectly straight and offered a warm, respectful smile. "Good morning, Madam CE." "Oh," David said, stepping aside to ensure my path was completely clear. "Good morning, David," I replied smoothly, walking through the gates and stepping into the private express elevator reserved strictly for top-tier executives. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, I stepped out into a sprawling, high-tech corporate headquarters. The walls were lined with vibrant digital displays showcasing award-winning 3D animations, interactive bilingual education platforms, and global streaming statistics. This was not a modest freelance operation. This was the nerve center of a massive, ultra-lucrative digital education corporation. As I walked down the central corridor, directors and department heads stopped their conversations to greet me. Project managers stepped aside, bowing their heads respectfully. I was not the quiet, submissive girl who sat in the corner at Sylvia's country club dinners. In this building, I was the absolute, undisputed authority. 6 years ago, I had taken a small private endowment left to me by my late grandfather. Sylvia had mocked that inheritance, calling it peasant money. Preston had told me to use it to buy designer handbags so I could look presentable around his wealthy friends. Instead, I quietly established a blind trust and funneled every single dollar into software development and digital licensing. I coded, I designed, I built a brand, I founded Lingo Smile Media. It started as a small interactive learning application for children. Then it exploded. Within 3 years, LingoSmile Media had grown into a premier 3D animation studio and digital education provider, holding the most exclusive and profitable children's media licenses in North America. My platforms were integrated into school districts nationwide. My animated series dominated global streaming charts. Preston had spent our entire marriage calling my career a cute little hobby. He told his elite friends that my digital drawings were worthless. The staggering irony was that the media empire I had built generated more clean, verified revenue in a single quarter than his fraudulent hedge fund had seen in its entire existence. I kept my name entirely off the public corporate records and state filings. I operated through a complex network of holding companies and strict non-disclosure agreements. I did it because I knew exactly who I had married. I knew that Preston and Sylvia were obsessed with status and unearned wealth. If they had known I was a multi-millionaire CEO, they would have drained my accounts to fund their lavish parties and prop up Preston's failing business ventures. Keeping my identity a secret was the ultimate shield against their endless greed. I walked into my expansive corner office where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. My desk was a massive slab of polished marble free of clutter. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, opened my laptop, and connected it to my secure network. My chief financial officer was already waiting in the private encrypted chat room. He had mobilized the acquisitions team precisely as I instructed during the night. The buyout protocols for the shadow lending firm holding Preston and Sylvia's massive family debt were fully underway. I looked down at my phone as the screen lit up with one final text message from Preston. "You are a nobody without me, Jocelyn. You are going to lose everything." I smiled a slow, genuine smile. I cracked my knuckles, placed my fingers over the keyboard, and began authorizing the multi-million-dollar corporate transfers. Preston was about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you mistake a woman's strategic silence for submission. The morning sun blazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my expansive flatiron office, casting a bright, determined light across the polished marble surfaces. I sat at my desk watching the digital global revenue trackers of LingoSmile Media tick upward in real time. My phone vibrated violently against the smooth stone. It was Preston again. He had sent a photo of my empty closet back at the luxury brownstone with a threatening caption attached. "I am having the locks changed immediately," the message read. "You have until noon to come back here, beg for my forgiveness, and agree to fix this mess with Diego. Otherwise, I am calling my lawyers and ensuring you walk away with absolutely nothing. You are a nobody, Jocelyn." I read the words and felt a profound sense of peace. I simply swiped the notification away. Preston was fiercely fighting a war that had already ended hours ago. He was swinging at shadows, completely unaware of the devastating reality rapidly approaching his doorstep. The heavy glass doors of my executive suite slid open silently. Kendrick walked in carrying a thick leather briefcase, his sharp analytical focus radiating across the room. Right behind him was Miles, my corporate chief financial officer. Miles was a brilliant financial mastermind who had helped me scale LingoSmile Media from a tiny digital startup into a global education and animation powerhouse. We gathered around the massive interactive conference table in the center of the room, ready to execute the most satisfying corporate maneuver of my entire life. "I have completely mapped out your husband's financial ecosystem," Miles said, pulling up a complex web of red and black data points on the primary wall monitor. Kendrick was absolutely right last night. Preston's hedge fund is essentially a sinking ship rapidly taking on water, but his personal liabilities are where he and Sylvia really exposed their throats. Kendrick pointed his gold pen at a specific data cluster glowing in deep red on the screen. "Look at this holding company right here, Jocelyn. Preston and Sylvia created a joint corporate entity just 3 weeks ago to secure a massive off-the-books loan. They bypassed traditional banking channels and went to a private shadow lending firm called Obsidian Capital. These guys are notorious in the financial district for predatory interest rates and absolutely brutal collection tactics." I leaned forward, tracing the digital trail connecting my husband to the shadow lenders. "How much did they borrow?" $12 million, Miles answered flatly, tapping his encrypted tablet. "They needed immediate liquid cash to float the failing hedge fund and hide the offshore losses from the upcoming federal audit. But Obsidian Capital does not hand out $12 million based on Preston's polished corporate smile and country club memberships. They demanded hard, tangible collateral. Sylvia's Hamptons estate. I said, the realization hitting me with sudden crystal clarity. Kendrick nodded, a fierce, triumphant grin spreading across his face. Exactly. They leveraged the ultimate crown jewel of her social standing. Sylvia put the deed to her multi-million-dollar oceanfront property on the line just to buy her son a few more weeks of breathing room. The contract is completely ruthless. If Preston misses a single payment or violates any term of the covenant, Obsidian Capital has the right to initiate an immediate non-judicial foreclosure. They can seize the property in a matter of days and liquidate it. The sheer poetry of the situation washed over me. I looked at the sprawling financial document projected on the screen. Sylvia had spent years parading that Hamptons estate in front of her high society friends, hosting lavish summer galas, and treating me like the hired help who was not fit to walk on her pristine imported rugs. She had slapped my face just hours ago, telling me I was a lower middle-class parasite. She had no idea she had essentially handed me the keys to her entire kingdom. Miles, I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and razor-sharp. Does Obsidian Capital sell their debt portfolios to third-party corporate entities? Miles adjusted his glasses, typing rapidly on his tablet to access the lending firm's public covenants. They do. They are a high-volume lending firm. They prefer immediate liquidity over holding long-term risk. If a verified corporate buyer offers to purchase a debt portfolio at a slight premium, they will transfer the paper without a second thought. They do not care who holds the leash as long as they get their money up front. Kendrick leaned his hands on the marble table, looking directly into my eyes. This is the kill shot, Jocelyn. If Lingo Smile Media purchases this specific loan portfolio through one of your anonymous holding companies, you step entirely into the shoes of the lender. You become the primary creditor for Preston and Sylvia. You will own their debt. You will hold the mortgage to that Hamptons estate. Preston thought he had trapped me by freezing a joint checking account that held a few $1,000s. He thought he was starving me out, forcing me into submission. Meanwhile, I was sitting in a corner office preparing to buy the actual roof over his mother's head. Do it, I commanded, looking directly at Miles. Initiate the corporate acquisition immediately. Buy the entire $12 million loan portfolio from Obsidian Capital. Offer them a 10% premium for an expedited transfer. I want the digital ink dry by lunchtime. Miles nodded, his fingers flying across the screen with practiced precision. Authorizing the wire transfer from our primary reserve accounts right now. The capital is moving. Kendrick opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I have already prepared the transfer of deed notices and the creditor assignment paperwork. Once Obsidian confirms the receipt of funds, the legal rights to the Hamptons property shift entirely to your corporate entity. Preston will not receive a notification until the end of the business day when his banking portal updates automatically. We stood around the monitor, watching the progress bar on the screen. The transfer protocol initiated, securely connecting our corporate servers to the private lending firm. Millions of dollars shifted through the digital banking infrastructure with absolute silence. It took less than 4 minutes to completely alter the trajectory of my husband's life. Transaction complete. Miles announced, pulling up the official confirmation receipt on the main display. Obsidian Capital has relinquished all rights to the loan. Lingo Smile Media Holdings is now the sole registered creditor. You own them, Jocelyn. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the bustling Manhattan streets far below. My phone vibrated one more time. It was an email from Preston's attorney serving me with a preliminary notice of divorce and demanding I surrender my laptop and any remaining family assets to his firm by tomorrow morning. I laughed softly at the absolute absurdity of their arrogance. They were playing checkers while I had already flipped the entire chessboard. Sylvia thought she could strike me across the face and command me to bow to her son. Preston thought he could sell my dignity to cover up his federal crimes. They were completely unaware that the solid ground beneath their feet had just vanished into thin air. I did not just survive their toxic storm. I had become the absolute force of nature that was about to wipe their pristine legacy off the map entirely. I sat in my corner office watching the digital confirmation of my loan acquisition settle securely into my corporate servers. Miles had set up a real-time tracking alert for any activity on Preston's newly acquired debt portfolio. It did not take long for the first alarm to trigger. Less than 2 hours after I purchased the $12 million loan, Preston attempted to draw funds from that exact line of credit. He was sitting in his flashy corner office, completely oblivious to the fact that his digital requests were now routing directly to my corporate dashboard. He was trying to extract $500,000 in liquid cash, presumably to use as a hollow show of good faith to keep Diego at the negotiation table. I watched his transaction request pop up on my screen. I did not even need to consult Miles. I simply clicked a red button labeled Deny and flagged the account for an emergency internal compliance review. I could easily picture Preston staring at his computer monitor in absolute disbelief. He probably slapped his expensive mahogany desk and yelled at his assistant, assuming it was a temporary glitch in the banking portal. He had spent his entire life bullying his way through minor inconveniences. He had no idea that the compliance officer rejecting his desperate plea for cash was the very wife he had tried to leave homeless earlier that morning. While Preston was busy screaming at customer service representatives, Kendrick was setting the second phase of our corporate siege into motion. We did not just want to choke off Preston's capital, we wanted to entirely obliterate his public credibility. Kendrick had taken the offshore routing numbers, the Shell Corporation data, and the undeniable evidence of massive wire fraud we uncovered during the night and compiled them into a highly detailed anonymous corporate prospectus. By noon, that devastating document was securely transmitted to the top investigative journalists at 3 major financial tech blogs. The financial world moves with ruthless speed when blood is in the water. At exactly 1 o'clock, the first article went live. The headline was a massive, glaring red banner across the financial sphere exposing Preston's hedge fund as a sophisticated Ponzi structure. The article detailed the severe compliance failures, the missing client funds, and the impending federal investigations. Within minutes, the story was picked up by major news outlets across the country. I watched the stock tickers and private valuation metrics on my office monitors. Preston's firm began to plummet instantly. The corporate reputation he valued above human life, the pristine image Sylvia had weaponized against me for 6 years, was disintegrating in real time. Investors were undoubtedly blowing up his phone, demanding immediate withdrawals. The firm was hemorrhaging credibility faster than any public relations team could ever patch up. Miles walked back into my office holding a fresh cup of coffee and a tablet displaying the absolute chaos unfolding on Wall Street. "He is drowning," Jocelyn Miles said, tapping the screen. "His primary investors are jumping ship. The only major player who has not publicly withdrawn is Diego." I knew exactly why Diego was hesitating. Diego was equally corrupt, and walking away now would mean writing off the substantial, unofficial investments he had already funneled into Preston's offshore accounts. Diego wanted his money back before the federal agents froze everything. Thanks to the diagnostic software I had embedded in Preston's smart home network months ago to monitor his financial abuse, I was able to intercept the audio of his frantic phone calls. I pulled up the encrypted feed and listened as Preston called Diego in a state of absolute hysteria. Preston sounded nothing like the arrogant man who had ordered my tap water the previous night. He was begging, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He swore the leaked prospectus was a smear campaign manufactured by a disgruntled former employee. He pleaded with Diego to ignore the blogs and keep his capital in the fund. Diego was furious. His thick accent cut through the phone line like a serrated knife. "You assured me your ledgers were clean, Preston. You promised me total security. Now half of Manhattan is reading about your federal wire fraud. I am not going down with your sinking ship." Preston begged harder, promising he could prove his family had massive liquid assets ready to cover any shortfalls. He invoked his mother's Hamptons estate, claiming it was free and clear, completely unaware that I now held the deed. He promised that the family's old money status would protect the firm from any scrutiny. Diego went silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of sympathy. I am giving you exactly one last chance to prove your liquidity, Diego demanded. Tomorrow night is the exclusive fundraising gala at the Metropolitan Club. Every major investor in the city will be there. If you cannot show me hard, verified proof of your family's financial stability and clean capital by tomorrow night, I am walking away. And I will personally hand the evidence of your fraud directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission to secure my own immunity. The call disconnected, leaving Preston breathing heavily into the silence. He had 24 hours to produce a financial miracle that did not exist. He was backed into the most terrifying corner of his entire life. He needed to project an image of absolute perfection and unshakable wealth at the most elite social event of the season. He would undoubtedly drag Sylvia along to play the role of the untouchable matriarch and use their combined arrogance to trick the investors into staying. I paused the audio feed and looked up at the Manhattan skyline. The Metropolitan Club was the absolute pinnacle of New York high society. It was the exact venue where Sylvia loved to parade her wealth and where Preston loved to boast about his financial dominance. They were going to walk into that ballroom tomorrow night, believing they could smile and lie their way out of a federal indictment. I picked up my phone and called Kendrick. My brother-in-law answered immediately, the sound of a busy law firm echoing in the background. "Kendrick," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and deliberate. "Clear your schedule for tomorrow evening. You and I are attending a fundraising gala at the Metropolitan Club." Kendrick let out a low, appreciative laugh. "I will rent a tuxedo, Jocelyn. What is the strategy?" "We are not just going to shut down his firm," I replied. "We are going to execute the final corporate takeover right in front of every single elite investor in the city. We are going to let them put on their fancy clothes, pour their expensive champagne, and then we are going to drop the anvil." It was time to show the high society of Manhattan exactly what happens when you underestimate the quiet woman sitting at the end of the table. The Metropolitan Club stood as an absolute fortress of old money and untouchable Manhattan elite. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant golden light over a sea of custom-tailored tuxedos and flawless diamond necklaces. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided across the polished marble floors carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. It was the most exclusive fundraising gala of the financial season. It was also the exact stage where my husband planned to execute his final desperate illusion. Preston and his mother Sylvia stood right in the center of the grand ballroom. From the outside, they looked like the absolute pinnacle of financial royalty. Preston wore a sharp velvet tuxedo projecting an aura of calm, unshakable confidence. Sylvia stood beside him draped in emerald silk and heavy heirloom pearls, laughing ostentatiously at jokes made by the surrounding board members. They were playing their roles to absolute perfection. Nobody in that glittering room knew that the mother and son holding court were drowning in millions of dollars of debt and actively facing a federal wire fraud indictment. I sat in the back of a tinted luxury sedan parked just across the street from the club, watching the elite guests file through the grand entrance. Kendrick sat beside me reviewing the final stack of certified legal documents we were about to drop on the entire assembly. He looked sharp and formidable in his tailored suit, a brilliant corporate defense attorney ready to dismantle a fraudulent empire. We were giving Preston just enough time to spin his web of lies before we tore it all down. Inside the ballroom, Preston was working the room with a sickening level of charm. Thanks to a contact I had inside the venue catering staff, I received real-time text updates about exactly what my husband was saying. Preston had cornered Diego near the main bar, desperately trying to soothe the angry venture capitalist. Diego was holding a glass of scotch, looking at Preston with heavy skepticism. The leaked corporate prospectus from that morning was the elephant in the room, and the whispers among the investors were growing louder by the minute. Diego demanded to know why I was not by my husband's side to project family unity. Preston did not miss a beat. He put on a masterclass performance of a devastated but stoic husband. "Jocelyn is currently resting at a private medical facility in Connecticut." Preston lied, his voice perfectly calibrated to project deep sorrow. "She suffered a sudden and severe nervous breakdown last night. The pressure of the city just became too much for her." Her mental instability has been a challenge for our family for months, but I am making sure she gets the psychiatric help she desperately needs. It was a brilliant and utterly terrifying manipulation. By claiming I was locked away in a psychiatric facility, Preston accomplished two things at once. He provided a convenient excuse for my sudden disappearance, and he completely discredited me in case I tried to go to the police or the press. If I came forward with evidence of his offshore accounts, or his disgusting attempt to sell me to Diego, he had already planted the seed that I was a delusional and vindictive woman suffering from a mental break. He was insulating himself, wrapping his crimes in the protective blanket of a family tragedy. A few feet away, Sylvia was executing her own calculated social maneuvering. She held court with a tight circle of wealthy investor wives sipping champagne and shaking her head with performative pity. I knew exactly what she was saying because she had been saying it behind my back for 6 years. "It is an absolute tragedy, but we always knew she was fragile," Sylvia whispered loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. Some girls from ordinary backgrounds simply cannot handle the pressure of elite society. She comes from a family of absolute nobodies. Preston tried his best to elevate her to give her a life of luxury and culture, but you cannot force class onto someone who fundamentally lacks it. Her little digital art hobby was just a coping mechanism. My poor son has carried the emotional weight of her inadequacy for years. Sylvia sighed, dabbing the corner of her eye with a cocktail napkin. She was reinforcing the exact narrative she had weaponized against me since the day of my wedding. She was painting me as a weak, lower-middle-class outsider who had finally cracked under the immense privilege of marrying into their pristine bloodline. She was using my fictional mental breakdown to elevate her son to the status of a long-suffering saint. They were completely in their element, surrounded by wealth and status, feeding lies to a room full of billionaires to buy themselves one more day of freedom. They thought their social standing made them invincible. They believed that because they wore expensive clothes and spoke with refined accents, the world would simply bow to their version of reality. In the back of the car, Kendrick checked his luxury watch. The luminous dial indicated it was exactly 8 o'clock. The main presentation was about to begin. "Preston will be stepping up to the podium right about now," Kendrick said, securing the financial ledgers inside his leather briefcase. "He is going to try to calm the shareholders. He will promise them that the leaked documents are a hoax and that his family has massive liquid assets ready to cover any market fluctuations. He is going to lie right to their faces." I looked at my own reflection in the tinted window of the car. I was not wearing a modest, understated dress chosen by my husband. I wore a custom midnight blue silk gown that draped perfectly across my frame, radiating absolute power and unapologetic wealth. I wore no jewelry because I did not need diamonds to command respect. My presence alone was about to shatter the foundation of that entire building. I turned to Kendrick and gave a single firm nod. "Let us go inside," I said, my voice steady and cold. "It is time to cure my nervous breakdown." We stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the grand entrance of the Metropolitan Club. The heavy brass doors loomed ahead, guarding a room full of arrogant men and status-obsessed women who were about to witness the most spectacular corporate execution in Manhattan history. Preston stood confidently at the polished mahogany podium, adjusting the microphone as he looked out over the sea of wealthy investors. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light over his velvet tuxedo, making him look every bit the untouchable Wall Street elite. I stood just outside the heavy double doors of the grand ballroom with Kendrick listening to my husband's voice echo through the venue speakers. Preston was delivering his masterclass performance. As many of you know, Preston said, his voice dipping into a tone of manufactured grief, "My wife Jocelyn suffered a severe mental collapse last night. She is currently receiving intensive psychiatric care at a private facility in Connecticut. It breaks my heart to stand here without her. The pressure of the city simply became too much for her fragile state. But the responsibility of managing my firm and protecting our investors must continue. Family resilience is the cornerstone of my company, and I assure you our financial foundation is stronger than ever." He raised his crystal champagne flute, proposing a toast to his own fabricated tragedy. The audience of billionaires and venture capitalists murmured in sympathetic agreement. Diego sat at the front table, nodding slowly, seemingly satisfied with the explanation for my absence. Sylvia stood nearby, wiping a fake tear from her eye, playing the role of the devastated mother-in-law to absolute perfection. Just as Preston brought the glass to his lips, Kendrick signaled the venue staff. The massive mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, thunderous thud. The sudden noise cut through the polite applause like a gunshot. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. I stood framed in the doorway. I did not look like a fragile woman recovering from a nervous breakdown in a psychiatric ward. I wore a custom midnight blue silk gown that flowed around me like liquid glass. My hair was styled flawlessly, and my posture projected absolute, unshakable power. Beside me stood Kendrick, looking incredibly sharp and formidable in his tailored tuxedo, holding a thick leather legal brief. We stepped into the ballroom, and the silence that swept over the crowd was absolute and total. I began walking down the center aisle. The wealthy wives who had just been whispering with Sylvia about my lower middle-class background stared at me with their mouths hanging open. Their champagne glasses hovered mid-air. I did not look down. I did not rush. I walked with the steady, deliberate pace of a sovereign entering her newly acquired territory. I was no longer the quiet, obedient housewife they were accustomed to ignoring. On the stage, Preston's champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the podium and shattered, sending expensive liquor splashing across his polished shoes. The color drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he might physically collapse. His eyes darted wildly, looking for security, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. The confident financial director was gone, replaced by a terrified man watching his executioner walk down the aisle. Sylvia recovered from her shock faster than her son. She saw her entire social standing flashing before her eyes. Her face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. She broke away from her tight circle of elite friends and marched directly into my path, attempting to intercept me before I could reach the primary investor tables. She moved with frantic, aggressive energy, her heavy heirloom pearls bouncing against her chest. She stepped right in front of me, blocking the aisle. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached out to grab my arm. Her voice dropped to a venomous, desperate whisper, meant only for me and Kendrick. "How dare you show your face here?" Sylvia hissed, the smell of sheer panic radiating from her pores. "Get out right now before security throws you back to the gutter where you belong. You are embarrassing my son. You are insane." I did not even break my stride. Kendrick stepped forward, smoothly breaking her grip on my arm with a single professional motion. He looked down at her with absolute corporate authority. The brilliant attorney she had belittled for years now stared at her with ice in his eyes. "Do not touch my client, Sylvia," Kendrick said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying legal weight. "You are currently standing in a building owned by her holding corporation. If you raise your hand again, I will have you arrested for assault on private property." Sylvia gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, as if she had been burned. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The wealthy guests surrounding us heard Kendrick's warning and began whispering frantically. I did not look at Sylvia. I did not give her the satisfaction of my anger. I simply looked past her toward the front of the room. I adjusted the sleeve of my midnight blue gown and continued walking, leaving Sylvia standing in the middle of the aisle, completely paralyzed by her own sudden insignificance. I walked straight toward the main investor table where Diego was sitting. Diego was watching the entire scene unfold with intense calculation. He looked at Preston trembling behind the podium and then looked at me. The arrogant venture capitalist recognized the profound shift in power. I reached the edge of his table and stopped. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had tried to purchase me 24 hours ago, preparing to show him exactly who was actually for sale tonight. I stood at the edge of the primary investor table looking directly into Diego's eyes. The arrogant venture capitalist who had tried to purchase my dignity 24 hours ago now stared back at me with profound uncertainty. The entire grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Club was trapped in a suffocating silence. The clinking of crystal glasses had stopped completely. The elite billionaires and socialites held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Up on the stage, Preston was a crumbling monument to his own arrogance. The shattered champagne flute lay at his feet, soaking into the hem of his velvet trousers. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning white, but he could not find his voice. The microphone picked up his ragged, panicked breathing, broadcasting it across the massive venue. Kendrick did not wait for an invitation. My brilliant brother-in-law stepped forward, his polished leather shoes making sharp, confident sounds against the marble floor. He bypassed the main table and walked directly up the short stairs to the presentation stage. Preston tried to step in front of the microphone, but Kendrick simply placed a firm hand on my husband's shoulder and moved him aside with effortless physical authority. Kendrick tapped the microphone once. The sound echoed like a gavel striking a block. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Kendrick said, his deep, resonant voice filling the enormous space. "For those who do not know me, my name is Kendrick. I am a senior partner at one of Manhattan's premier corporate defense firms. I am also the man standing between all of you and a massive federal indictment." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Wealthy men in expensive tuxedos shifted uncomfortably. Wives exchanged nervous glances. Down at the front table, Diego sat up perfectly straight, his dark eyes narrowing as he recognized the shift in power. Kendrick unlatched the heavy brass locks of his leather legal brief. He pulled out several thick certified financial ledgers bound in bright red legal tape. He did not hand them to Preston. He stepped down from the stage and placed the first massive ledger directly onto the table in front of Diego. Then he handed identical copies to the other primary shareholders seated in the front row. "What you are holding in your hands are the true unredacted financial disclosures for this hedge fund," Kendrick announced, projecting his voice so even the people in the back row could hear every single syllable. "The man standing on this stage has not been generating profits for the past 14 months. He has been running a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar Ponzi structure." The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of panicked whispers. Investors frantically flipped open the heavy folders, their eyes scanning the highlighted documents. Kendrick paced slowly in front of the stage, commanding the room with absolute mastery. "Your quarterly statements have been completely fabricated. The capital you entrusted to this firm was actively funneled through offshore shell corporations located in the Cayman Islands to hide catastrophic market losses from the Securities and Exchange Commission. You are not looking at a temporary liquidity issue tonight. You are looking at massive, premeditated federal wire fraud." Preston grabbed the edges of the podium, shaking his head wildly. "It is a lie," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with pure terror. "He is lying to you. These documents are forged. This is an extortion attempt." No one was looking at Preston. Every single investor was staring at the certified banking routing numbers printed on the crisp white paper. Diego traced his finger over a specific highlighted transaction, a transfer of his own capital moving into a private offshore account. The Spanish investor's face twisted into an expression of absolute lethal fury. He realized he had been played for an absolute fool. Suddenly, the pristine atmosphere of the ballroom was shattered by a high-pitched, piercing scream. Sylvia could no longer maintain her facade. The old money matriarch saw her entire social dynasty collapsing in real time. Her son was being exposed as a federal criminal in front of the most powerful people in New York. The absolute terror of losing her status completely snapped her fragile grip on reality. She lunged forward, breaking away from her circle of wealthy friends. Her face was contorted into an ugly, hateful mask. She marched directly toward Kendrick, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at his face. "How dare you!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You think you can walk into my event and destroy my family? You are nothing but a glorified token attorney trying to extort an elite family? You do not belong in this room. You have never belonged in our world." She did not stop there. The panic stripped away the last layer of her polite high society restraint, revealing the deeply ingrained bigotry she had hidden behind fake smiles for years. She hurled a series of vile racial slurs at Kendrick, calling him a parasite who was trying to drag her pristine bloodline into the dirt. The entire ballroom gasped in collective horror. The wealthy elite of Manhattan might have tolerated subtle corporate corruption, but Sylvia's aggressive public display of blatant racism was a catastrophic social suicide. The investor wives who had just been whispering with her physically backed away, treating her like she had suddenly contracted a deadly disease. Kendrick did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words hang in the air for everyone to hear. He looked down at her with an expression of absolute freezing pity. "Your son is going to federal prison," Sylvia Kendrick said quietly, but the microphone picked up every word. "And your racist entitlement is not going to bail him out." Kendrick raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the back of the room. The Metropolitan Club security staff, who were legally bound to follow strict venue guidelines regarding abusive behavior, immediately moved into action. 4 broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits marched down the center aisle. They surrounded Sylvia, cutting her off from the rest of the room. "Madam, you need to leave the premises immediately," the head of security ordered, stepping between her and Kendrick. Sylvia thrashed against them, her heavy heirloom pearls swinging wildly. "I am Sylvia. My family funded this club. You cannot touch me. I demand you remove this man." The security guards did not engage in a debate. They firmly grasped her arms, locking her into place, and began marching her toward the exit. Sylvia thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities as she was dragged down the main aisle. The glittering crowd parted like the Red Sea, watching the once untouchable matriarch being forcefully ejected from the most exclusive gala of the season. I stood perfectly still, watching her humiliating departure. For 6 years, she had commanded me to bow my head. She had slapped my face and told me I was trash. Now she was the one being thrown out into the cold New York night, entirely isolated and completely destroyed by her own toxic arrogance. I turned my attention back to the stage. Preston was hyperventilating, clinging to the podium like a man drowning in a stormy ocean. His mother was gone. His investors knew the truth. But I was not finished. It was time to show him exactly who was holding the deed to his entire miserable existence. The heavy brass doors of the Metropolitan Club swung shut, cutting off the sound of Sylvia screaming as the security guards dragged her out into the cold night. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The elite crowd of billionaires and venture capitalists stood completely frozen, processing the sheer magnitude of the public execution they had just witnessed. Up on the presentation stage, Preston realized he was entirely alone. His mother was gone. His fraudulent financial ledgers were resting in the hands of every major shareholder in the room. He looked down at the certified banking routing numbers exposing his massive offshore shell corporations, and sheer blind panic took over his entire body. Preston gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He looked out at the sea of horrified faces and made one final desperate attempt to save his crumbling dynasty. He decided to double down on his lies. "Do not listen to them," Preston shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at Kendrick and me. "These documents are completely fabricated. I told you my wife is deeply unwell. She is having a severe psychotic break. She had a disgusting affair with some broke freelance artist, and when I found out, I froze her joint accounts to protect my assets. This is nothing but the desperate revenge of a cheating, unstable woman trying to ruin my pristine firm." He turned toward the front table, looking directly at the Spanish investor. "Diego, you know me. You know my family. You know I run a clean fund. Do not let this crazy woman cost us millions of dollars." I did not yell. I did not defend my character. I simply gathered the flowing skirt of my midnight blue silk gown and walked up the short velvet stairs to the presentation stage. Kendrick stepped aside smoothly, giving me total command of the platform. I walked right up to the podium and stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband. Preston physically flinched, expecting me to scream or slap him. I did neither. I looked at the massive digital projector screen taking up the entire wall behind us. Preston had set it up to display a slideshow of his fabricated quarterly projections to the donors. I reached across the podium, unplugged the display cable from his sleek corporate laptop, and plugged it directly into my phone. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed through the massive venue, carrying a tone of absolute freezing authority. "My husband just told all of you that I was currently locked away in a private psychiatric facility in Connecticut. I said, scanning the crowd of wealthy investors. He told you I was unstable and unfaithful. Since it is abundantly clear that I am standing right here in my right mind, accompanied by top-tier legal counsel, let us examine exactly what else my husband has been lying about tonight. I tapped the screen of my phone. The massive 50-foot display behind me instantly illuminated the dark ballroom. I did not show them financial spreadsheets. I showed them high-definition screenshots of encrypted text messages between Preston and Diego, sent just hours before our dinner the previous night. The crowd leaned in, reading the exchange. Preston had sent a message detailing his desperate need for the $5 million bridge loan to hide his SEC violations. Diego's response was right there on the screen. I need more than equity to overlook a federal crime, Preston. Bring your wife to dinner. Make sure she wears black. A shockwave rippled through the audience. Wealthy investor wives covered their mouths in horror. But I was not finished. I swiped my screen, opening my cloud-synced voice memos. I pressed play. The high-quality audio file I had recorded at the Michelin-starred restaurant blasted through the state-of-the-art surround sound system of the Metropolitan Club. Preston's arrogant voice filled the room, crystal clear and undeniable. Esta noche ella es tuya. Consider it a down payment on the $5 million capital call. Then came his English translation, meant to secure the deal while keeping me completely in the dark. Jocelyn is a homebody. She has a cute little digital art hobby. It keeps her busy while I handle the real work. I take care of her so she does not have to worry her pretty little head about adult problems. The collective gasp from the ballroom was loud enough to shake the crystal chandeliers. Wall Street executives are accustomed to ruthless corporate takeovers and aggressive financial maneuvering. But trading a wife like a commodity to secure a bridge loan and cover up a federal felony was a line of depravity that completely disgusted even the most hardened billionaires in the room. The cameras and phones of 100 elite investors instantly turned away from the stage and aimed directly at the front table. Diego was completely exposed. The sophisticated venture capitalist sat frozen under the blinding glare of the ballroom lights. His dark eyes went wide with sheer terror as he realized his pristine international reputation was being eviscerated on a 50-foot screen. He was sweating profusely through his bespoke suit. He pushed his heavy chair back violently, the wood scraping loudly against the marble floor as he tried to put physical distance between himself and Preston's toxic fallout. Diego stood up, holding his hands out defensively. He began shouting in rapid Spanish, denying the context, claiming he never agreed to the final terms of the arrangement. But his own text messages were still glowing brightly on the massive screen behind me, proving his undeniable complicity in the vile transaction. I do not know this man, Diego yelled in heavily accented English, pointing at the stage. I am pulling my entire venture capital fund immediately. I will not be associated with this sickness. All around the ballroom, board members pulled out their phones. The polite silence of the gala was entirely replaced by the frantic sounds of dialing. I could hear powerful men barking orders to their public relations teams, their crisis managers, and their personal attorneys. Everyone in the room was scrambling to draft press releases and cut ties with Preston's hedge fund before the morning news cycle hit the wire. They were severing his professional lifelines one by one right in front of his eyes. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Club descended into absolute chaos. The sheer panic radiating from the investor tables was palpable. Mateo was already moving toward the exit, surrounded by his frantic aides, shouting rapidly in Spanish as he tried to put as much physical distance as possible between himself and my husband. Board members were rushing toward the cloakroom, dialing their public relations teams with trembling hands. On the presentation stage, Derek stood completely frozen. His meticulously crafted corporate empire was burning to ash right in front of his eyes. The leaked financial prospectus had wounded him, but the audio recording of his vile transaction with Mateo had delivered the fatal blow. His reputation was dead. His firm was dead. But as he looked out at the fleeing billionaires, the shock in his eyes rapidly mutated into the desperate cornered rage of a trapped animal. Derek gripped the heavy mahogany podium, his knuckles turning stark white. He realized he had lost the room, but he could not accept that he had lost to me. He grabbed the microphone, tearing it from its stand. His voice echoed through the massive venue, sharp and laced with pure venom. "You think you have won?" Derek screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You think humiliating me in front of my investors makes you a winner? You are still nothing, Vanessa. You are a broke, pathetic freelancer who relies on my charity to survive." The remaining investors who had not yet fled the ballroom paused. They turned back toward the stage, drawn by the spectacle of a man completely unraveling. "I froze the joint accounts," Derek continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I locked you out of the brownstone. You walked out into the rain with a single backpack. You have absolutely no credit, no savings, and no home. You signed a ruthless prenuptial agreement a week before our wedding. I made sure of it. You leave this marriage with nothing but the clothes on your back. You can play the hero tonight, but tomorrow morning you will be begging on the streets." I did not raise my voice to match his hysteria. I stood perfectly still in my custom midnight blue silk gown, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. I stepped closer to him, the silk of my dress brushing against his ruined velvet trousers. I looked down at his panicked, sweating face. "I did not open that backpack in Kendrick's office to steal your money, Derek," I said, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze the air between us. "I did not care about your frozen joint accounts or your locked doors." I opened my backpack to retrieve my grandfather's true ironclad trust records. Derek frowned, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second. "What trust records?" he spat. "Your family has nothing. You come from a line of lower middle-class nobodies. My mother told everyone exactly what you are." Before I could respond, Kendrick stepped smoothly up to the microphone. My brilliant brother-in-law exuded absolute corporate dominance. He did not look like the man Derek's family had constantly belittled and treated as an outsider. He looked like the legal executioner of their entire dynasty. Kendrick unlatched a separate compartment of his leather legal brief and pulled out a thick stack of certified documents bound in heavy blue legal tape. "Since Derek seems so confident in his financial superiority, let us examine the actual distribution of wealth in this marriage," Kendrick announced, projecting his deep, resonant voice across the ballroom. Kendrick held up the certified documents for the remaining audience to see. Vanessa's maternal grandfather was not a nobody. He was a highly successful silent real estate tycoon. He recognized the profound greed in his own daughter long before Vanessa was even born. He knew that if he left his fortune to Vanessa's mother, she would squander it on status symbols and superficial luxury. Derek stared at Kendrick, his breathing growing shallow and ragged. "So he bypassed her entirely." Kendrick continued, opening the heavy folder. 20 years ago, he established an irrevocable non-marital asset trust strictly for Vanessa. This trust contains $70 million in liquid real estate holdings and diversified corporate assets. It was fully funded, completely taxes paid, and actively generating massive compound interest long before Vanessa ever met you. The remaining billionaires in the room gasped loudly. The wealthy wives who had lingered near the exit stared at me with their mouths hanging open. $70 million. The number hung in the air like a physical weight, crushing the very breath out of my husband's lungs. "You are lying," Derek whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. His eyes darted wildly between me and the legal documents. "She draws cartoons. She has no money. This is a bluff to force a settlement. It is fully verified and certified by the state Supreme Court," Kendrick replied, handing a copy of the executive summary directly to Derek. "But the true brilliance of this situation lies in the very weapon you thought you were using to control her." Kendrick stepped closer to Derek, delivering the final devastating legal blow. "You were so obsessed with protecting your precious corporate bonuses that you forced Vanessa to sign a draconian prenuptial agreement. You insisted that any assets acquired independently or held in a blind trust prior to the marriage would remain strictly and entirely separate property. You demanded a total financial firewall between you and your wife." Derek looked down at the documents, his hands shaking violently. "Congratulations, Derek," Kendrick said, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across his face. Your prenuptial agreement is ironclad. By trying to ensure your wife left with nothing, you legally shielded her entire $70 million fortune from your catastrophic debts. The federal government can seize your offshore accounts, they can liquidate your firm, and they can demand massive restitution for your wire fraud. But they cannot touch a single cent of Vanessa's trust. You protected her wealth perfectly. The realization hit Derek with the force of a freight train. His knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the podium to stop himself from collapsing onto the polished stage. The woman he had treated like a financial parasite, the wife he had constantly belittled and humiliated, was an independent multimillionaire. The woman he had tried to sell to a corrupt investor to cover a $5 million hole was actually worth 14 times more than the loan he was begging for. He had been sleeping next to a fortune for 6 years, and his own blinding arrogance had kept him completely in the dark. I looked at my husband, watching the last shreds of his ego disintegrate. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken. The elite investors who were still standing in the ballroom were no longer looking at him. They were looking at me. Their eyes were filled with profound awe and absolute respect. They realized they were not standing in the presence of a broken housewife. They were standing in the presence of a woman who held absolute power. But I was not quite finished. Derek thought losing his firm and realizing my true net worth was the bottom of his nightmare. He had no idea I was about to drop the final contract on the table, revealing exactly who now owned the debt to his entire miserable existence. The silence in the grand ballroom was broken by the sound of a heavy chair scraping violently against the marble floor. Matteo stood up, his face flushed with a terrifying mix of humiliation and absolute rage. He looked at Derek, who was still gripping the edges of the mahogany podium like a broken man. Matteo slammed his fist onto the primary investor table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes. "You are completely finished," Derek Matteo shouted, his thick Spanish accent echoing across the room. "I am pulling my entire venture capital fund immediately. I am liquidating every single asset tied to your name. Your fraudulent firm will be in total bankruptcy by midnight, and I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your life rotting in a federal prison cell." The remaining investors murmured in agreement. Matteo turning his back on Derek was the final nail in the coffin. Derek's corporate empire was officially dead. Matteo turned to his aides, barking rapid orders in Spanish to initiate the immediate withdrawal of all offshore capital. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and prepared to storm out of the Metropolitan Club, eager to distance his own massive global fund from the radioactive fallout of my husband's crimes. I stepped forward, my custom midnight blue gown gliding across the polished floor. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer authority in my tone stopped the powerful venture capitalist dead in his tracks. "You do not need to pull your capital out tonight, Matteo," I said, my voice perfectly steady and razor-sharp. Matteo turned around, his dark eyes narrowing with suspicion. He looked at me, no longer seeing the quiet, submissive housewife from the restaurant. He saw a woman standing next to a top-tier corporate defense attorney guarding a $70 million trust. But he still thought he held the upper hand in the financial world. "Excuse me," Matteo scoffed, crossing his arms. "Your husband just tried to use you as a human bargaining chip to cover up a federal felony. Why on earth would you defend his crumbling firm? I am liquidating everything and walking away." I walked down the short velvet stairs of the presentation stage and approached his table. Kendrick walked right beside me, holding a crisp, pristine manila envelope. I stopped just a few feet away from Matteo. "I am not defending his firm," I corrected, maintaining absolute eye contact. "I am simply informing you that liquidating your assets is no longer your decision to make. Because as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, my media corporation purchased the primary debt portfolio of this entire firm. I am now the sole owner of the building you are standing in, and I am the primary creditor of Derek's life." Derek let out a strangled gasp from the stage. He stared at me, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. He finally understood why his frantic attempts to access his private line of credit had been blocked earlier that morning. Matteo frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He looked at the envelope in Kendrick's hand, and then back at me. What kind of media corporation buys out a predatory $12 million shadow loan? Kendrick stepped forward and placed the envelope directly onto the table in front of Mateo. He opened the flap and slid a multi-page corporate acquisition contract onto the white linen tablecloth. The digital ink was dry. The transfer of deed was fully certified by the State Financial Regulatory Board. I suggest you read the name of the holding company at the top of the contract, Mateo, I said, gesturing to the crisp white paper. Mateo leaned over the table. He traced his finger across the bold black text at the top of the legal document. Lingo Smile Media Holding, LLC. For a moment, Mateo just stared at the name. Then the color drained from his face so rapidly he looked as though he might pass out. His confident, aggressive posture completely collapsed. He looked up at me, sheer absolute terror replacing the arrogance in his dark eyes. Lingo Smile, Mateo whispered, his voice cracking. I smiled a slow, terrifying smile. That is correct, Mateo. I am the anonymous founder and sole chief executive officer of Lingo Smile Media. The billionaire investors surrounding the table began whispering frantically. They all knew the name. Lingo Smile was a titan in the digital education and 3D animation industry. But Mateo knew it better than anyone else in the room. Mateo's entire multi-billion-dollar global venture capital fund relied entirely on children's media licensing and distribution networks across Europe and the Americas. His massive streaming platforms generated billions of dollars in ad revenue, but they were completely dependent on licensed content. And my company, Lingo Smile Media, held the exclusive corporate copyrights to his entire network's digital library. You are the CEO. Mateo stammered, taking a stumbling step backward. He suddenly realized that he had not just insulted a wealthy woman. He had sexually harassed and attempted to purchase the very woman who held the absolute power to revoke his most lucrative global licensing agreements. I own the educational content that generates 60% of your annual global revenue, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal pitch. I own the animation studios that supply your international streaming platforms. If I terminate those licensing agreements tomorrow morning, your multi-billion-dollar fund will crash faster than Derek's fraudulent empire. Mateo began to sweat profusely. The wealthy, arrogant man who had slid his hand onto my thigh under a restaurant table just 24 hours ago was now visibly trembling in front of me. He realized that the quiet woman he had treated like a disposable commodity was actually the apex predator of his entire industry. Please, Mateo begged, holding his hands up defensively. Madam CEO, I had no idea who you were. Derek completely misled me. I never would have disrespected you if I knew you were the head of Lingo Smile. I took a step closer, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. That is exactly the problem, Mateo. You only respect women when you realize they have the financial power to destroy you. You thought because I was quiet and wearing a dress my husband bought that you could treat me like an object to be traded over a steak dinner. Mateo swallowed hard, looking around the ballroom for any sort of lifeline, but the other investors were stepping away from him, treating him like a walking liability. I am not going to ruin your global fund tonight, Mateo, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. But you are going to sit down. You are going to sign over your remaining equity in Derek's firm directly to my holding company at a total loss. And then you are going to walk out of my building and never set foot in New York City again. Do we have an understanding? And Mateo did not argue. He did not negotiate. The powerful venture capitalist pulled a gold pen from his tuxedo pocket, his hands shaking violently as he signed the corporate transfer documents Kendrick placed in front of him. He surrendered millions of dollars in equity just to escape the catastrophic wrath of my media empire. When he finished signing, he dropped the pen, backed away from the table, and practically ran toward the exit of the Metropolitan Club, his aides scrambling to follow him. I turned my attention back to the presentation stage. Derek was still standing behind the podium, but he looked like a hollow, empty shell of a man. His investors were gone. His business partner had just surrendered to me. I owned the massive debt tied to his mother's Hamptons estate. I had legally protected my $70 million trust. I had systematically stripped away every single asset, every ounce of power, and every shred of dignity he had ever possessed. But the final domino was yet to fall. As Derek stared at me through eyes filled with absolute broken despair, the heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open one last time. The heavy brass doors of the Metropolitan Club swung open with a forceful, commanding crash. The remaining investors who had lingered to witness the fallout immediately stepped back, pressing themselves against the silk-lined walls of the ballroom. This time it was not a group of angry shareholders or high-priced corporate lawyers walking through the entrance. 4 men and 2 women marched down the center aisle, moving with a synchronized military precision that instantly sucked the remaining air out of the room. They wore dark tailored suits, but it was the unmistakable gold shields clipped to their belts and the bold yellow letters printed across the backs of their windbreakers that sent a final lethal shockwave through the crowd. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. They were accompanied by elite white-collar crime investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Kendrick had not just sent the anonymous prospectus to the financial blogs. He had simultaneously filed a comprehensive whistleblower report directly to the federal authorities, complete with all the offshore routing numbers and fraudulent ledgers we had uncovered during the night. Preston stood on the presentation stage entirely paralyzed. He watched the federal agents march toward him, and the last remaining shreds of his corporate arrogance evaporated into thin air. His knees physically buckled under the crushing weight of his reality. The man who had spent 6 years making me feel completely powerless dropped to his knees on the polished hardwood floor, his custom velvet tuxedo rumpling around him. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror finally broke through his facade, streaming down his pale face. Just as the lead federal agent reached the steps of the stage, a frantic, screaming voice echoed from the grand foyer. Sylvia burst back into the ballroom. She had apparently been fighting with the venue security staff in the lobby ever since she was ejected. When she saw the federal agents marching in, she must have assumed they were responding to the chaotic scene and barged her way past the distracted guards. Her hair was disheveled, her emerald silk gown was wrinkled, and she looked entirely unhinged. Sylvia saw her son kneeling on the stage and lunged forward. She threw herself between Preston and the lead federal agent, holding her arms out in a desperate, delusional attempt to shield her golden boy. "Get away from him!" Sylvia shrieked, her voice hoarse and frantic. "Do you know who we are? We are one of the most prominent families in Manhattan. You should be arresting her." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "My daughter-in-law orchestrated this entire hoax. She is a mentally unstable parasite trying to steal our wealth. Arrest her right now." The lead federal agent did not even blink. He looked at Sylvia with the cold, detached professionalism of a man who had taken down hundreds of arrogant billionaires. He stepped around her effortlessly and looked down at my husband. "Are you Preston?" the agent asked, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet ballroom. Preston could not speak. He just stared at the shiny steel handcuffs resting on the agent's belt and let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. "You are under arrest," the federal agent announced, pulling Preston up by his arms and spinning him around. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The agent pulled Preston's arms behind his back, and the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place echoed through the microphone still resting on the podium. Furthermore, the agent continued, his voice unwavering. "You are being charged with severe identity theft. We have obtained certified documentation proving that you intentionally forged your wife's digital signature on multiple off-the-books loan modifications to secure predatory capital from shadow lending firms. You used her identity to leverage assets without her legal consent. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Preston squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing openly as the reality of his 20-year federal prison sentence locked firmly into place. He had tried to leave me homeless and destitute, but his own fraudulent greed had secured his spot in a federal detention facility. Sylvia let out a blood-curdling scream. She grabbed the sleeve of the federal agent, trying to pull him away from her son. "You cannot do this. We have offshore accounts. We will hire the best defense team in the country. You are making a catastrophic mistake." One of the white-collar crime investigators, a tall woman with a stern expression, stepped forward and gently but firmly detached Sylvia's hand from the agent's arm. The investigator did not pull out a pair of handcuffs. Instead, she opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a crisp legal document bearing the official seal of the state Supreme Court. "I am not here to arrest you today, ma'am," the investigator said, handing the document directly to Sylvia. "But I am legally obligated to serve you with this notice." Sylvia snatched the paper, her hands trembling violently. "What is this?" she demanded, her eyes darting across the legal text. "That is an immediate non-judicial foreclosure eviction notice," the investigator explained calmly. "As a result of the federal fraud investigation and the subsequent violation of your lending covenants, the primary creditor of your shadow loan has triggered an immediate seizure of your collateral assets." Sylvia stared at the paper, her breathing growing rapid and shallow. The investigator delivered the final devastating blow. "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the Hamptons estate. The property is now entirely legally owned by Lingo Smile Media Holding Corporation. The local sheriff's department will arrive tomorrow at noon to change the locks and remove any remaining personal property from the premises." Sylvia slowly lowered the paper. She turned her head and looked directly at me. The absolute horrific realization hit her with the force of a physical strike. I was the chief executive officer of Lingo Smile Media. I was the primary creditor. I was the one foreclosing on her beloved high society estate. The untouchable matriarch who had thrown my design award in the trash, who had slapped my face and called me a lower middle class. Nobody finally understood the magnitude of her fatal mistake. She had handed the deed to her entire kingdom directly to the woman she had abused for 6 years. Sylvia's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the floor of the presentation stage, landing right next to her handcuffed, sobbing son. The heavy heirloom pearls around her neck snapped against the hardwood, sending small white beads scattering across the floor. She sat there, surrounded by the ruins of her precious dynasty, completely stripped of her wealth, her status, and her pride. I stood a few feet away, watching the federal agents haul Preston to his feet and begin marching him down the center aisle. Kendrick stood beside me, closing his leather briefcase with a satisfying click. We did not say a word to Preston as he was paraded past us. We did not need to. The total, absolute destruction of his life spoke entirely for itself. 48 hours had passed since the federal agents escorted my husband out of the Metropolitan Club in handcuffs. The ensuing media firestorm was spectacular. Financial news networks ran nonstop coverage of Preston's collapsed hedge fund, detailing the offshore shell corporations and the massive wire fraud indictment. The high society circles that had once revered his family severed all ties overnight. I sat behind the polished marble desk in my high-ceilinged corner office at Lingo Smile Media. The morning sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the sleek, modern space in a warm, golden light. I held a cup of black coffee, watching the Manhattan skyline wake up to a brand-new week. The air in my executive suite was entirely serene. There was no shouting, no manipulation, and no frantic attempts to cover up financial felonies. For the first time in 6 years, my environment perfectly matched the absolute clarity in my mind. The quiet hum of my office was interrupted by the gentle chime of my secure intercom system. My executive assistant spoke through the speaker, her voice carrying a distinct tone of professional discomfort. "Madame CEO," my assistant said, "there is a woman in the main lobby demanding to see you. She bypasses security protocols because she claims to be your mother-in-law. She is extremely distressed and begging for an audience. Building security is prepared to remove her from the premises, but I wanted to request your authorization first." I set my coffee mug down on the marble desk. The untouchable matriarch had finally found her way to my fortress. "Send her up," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But inform security they are to escort her directly to my office and wait right outside the door. She has exactly 3 minutes of my time." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, waiting for the elevator doors to open down the hall. I expected Sylvia to march in with her usual aggressive entitlement, demanding that I fix her son's legal catastrophe. But the woman who was escorted into my executive suite a few moments later was completely unrecognizable. Sylvia looked as though she had aged 2 decades in the span of 48 hours. The brittle elegance she had weaponized against me for years was entirely gone. Her hair, which was usually styled to immaculate perfection, hung limply around her pale face. She wore a plain, wrinkled trench coat, devoid of the heavy heirloom pearls and designer accessories she used to flaunt. Her eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, darting frantically around my sprawling corner office, taking in the massive digital displays and the sheer, undeniable wealth of the empire I had built. She stood in front of my desk, trembling violently. The security guards took their positions just outside the glass doors, leaving us alone in the quiet room. Jocelyn. Sylvia whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. Please, I am begging you. You have to stop this. I did not stand up to greet her. I did not offer her a seat. I just looked at her, letting the silence stretch between us until her discomfort became physically unbearable. Stop what exactly, Sylvia? I asked, my tone devoid of any human sympathy. Stop the federal government from prosecuting your son for the millions of dollars he stole. Or stop the natural consequences of your own massive predatory debts. Sylvia stepped closer, gripping the edge of my marble desk with shaking hands. They froze all of my accounts. She cried, tears spilling over her eyelashes and dropping onto the polished stone. Preston's legal defense retainers are astronomical. The top-tier defense attorneys will not even look at his case without a $2 million cash deposit, and I have absolutely nothing left. The banks will not return my calls. My friends will not even let me pass their front gates. She let out a ragged, desperate gasp. And the Hamptons estate. The sheriff's department arrived this morning. They are changing the locks. They told me I have until noon to remove my personal items before they clear the property entirely. Jocelyn, you own the debt. You are the primary creditor. You can stop the foreclosure. You can give me my house back. Please, we are going to be completely homeless. I watched her weep. I watched the woman who had slapped my face and called me a lower-middle-class parasite beg for her absolute survival. I did not offer her a tissue. I felt absolutely no pity for the tears of a woman who was only crying because she had finally run out of victims to exploit. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I bypassed the corporate acquisition contracts and the legal ledgers, pulling out a single high-gloss photograph. It was a candid picture taken on the morning of my wedding 6 years ago. I placed the photograph face up on the marble desk, sliding it toward her. In the picture, I was standing in my white bridal gown, looking nervously toward the camera. Sylvia was standing in the background. The photographer had captured her in the exact moment she was dropping my Regional Graphic Design Award into the trash can. Her face in the photo bore a sickening, cruel smirk. It was the face of a woman who truly believed she had just established absolute dominance over a weak, worthless girl. Sylvia stared at the photograph, her trembling hands hovering over the image. Next to the photograph, I placed a crisp white legal document. It was the finalized, non-judicial foreclosure eviction notice for her multi-million-dollar Hamptons estate, bearing the official seal of the state Supreme Court and my corporate signature as the sole proprietor. You walked into my bridal suite 6 years ago and told me I was nothing. I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal pitch. You threw my accomplishments in the garbage and told me I should be on my hands and knees thanking your family for rescuing me from a life of mediocrity. You spent our entire marriage mocking my career, telling your wealthy friends that I was an inadequate, uncultured outsider. Sylvia let out a pathetic whimpering sound, shaking her head wildly. I was wrong, she sobbed. I was so wrong, Jocelyn. Please show some mercy. We are family. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk. You slapped my face 3 days ago, Sylvia. You demanded that I prostitute myself to a corrupt venture capitalist to cover up your son's federal felony. You looked me dead in the eye and told me that trash always returns to the gutter. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the eviction notice. I am not showing you mercy, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am just ensuring your address is correct. Sylvia let out a devastating, breathless wail. Her knees buckled and she slumped against the edge of the desk, completely broken by the reality of her own destruction. She had handed me the deed to her entire kingdom, and I had just locked the gates forever. I pressed the button on my intercom system. David. Please escort this woman out of my building. Her 3 minutes are up. If she attempts to enter this facility again, you are authorized to have her arrested for trespassing." The heavy glass doors slid open instantly. The security guard stepped into the executive suite, grasping Sylvia firmly by the arms. She did not fight them. All the fight had been completely drained out of her. She was hauled out of my office, weeping uncontrollably, a disgraced fallen matriarch being dragged out of the very empire she had claimed did not exist. The glass doors closed, sealing my office in perfect, serene quiet once again. I picked up the wedding photograph, tore it neatly down the middle, and dropped it directly into the trash can beside my desk. The past was officially discarded. I turned my attention back to my computer monitors, ready to finish the final legal maneuver that would permanently sever my ties to the man currently rotting in a federal holding cell. My husband took me to meet his business partner. "Tonight she is yours." He said it in Spanish. He thought I did not understand a word. 20 minutes later, his face went pale. "My name is Jocelyn, and I am 33 years old. For 6 years, I played the role of a quiet, obedient wife to a high-powered Manhattan financial director. Before I share exactly how I destroyed his entire life in a single evening, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had someone mistake your silence for weakness." The private dining room of a Michelin-starred restaurant in the heart of New York City smelled of expensive truffles and aged leather. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the white linen tablecloths. I sat with my posture perfectly straight, wearing a modest tailored black dress that my husband Preston had specifically chosen for me. He always liked me to look elegant but muted, never flashy enough to outshine his corporate image. Preston sat next to me, fidgeting slightly with his solid gold cufflinks. He was desperate. I knew his hedge fund had been bleeding money for months, but he refused to discuss his failures with me. He wanted to maintain the illusion that he was the untouchable provider of our household. Across from us sat Diego, an influential venture capitalist from Madrid, who held the keys to a $5 million bridge loan. Preston desperately needed that capital injection to avoid complete financial ruin and a possible federal investigation into his firm. The conversation had been tense from the start. Diego swirled his vintage Cabernet, looking at Preston with an expression of supreme boredom. Preston was sweating through his custom-tailored suit. He laughed too loudly at Diego's jokes and nodded too eagerly at every business philosophy the older man shared. Then the atmosphere shifted entirely. Preston gave me a sickeningly sweet smile, patting my hand where it rested on the table. He turned his attention back to Diego, and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Esta noche ella es tuya. Consider it a down payment on the $5 million capital call." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Tonight she is yours. My own husband, the man I had vowed to build a life with, was offering my body to a stranger to cover up his gross financial incompetence. A cold wave of shock washed over me, followed instantly by a burning, razor-sharp rage. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I kept my breathing perfectly even. I did not flinch. I did not gasp. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. Preston smirked fully, believing his secret was safe. I had spent 2 years studying in Madrid during my early 20s, perfecting a sharp Castilian accent, but Preston never paid enough attention to my past to remember that detail. He never asked about my life before him. To him, I was just a simple freelancer, a girl who spent her days doodling on an iPad. He thought my world was small and entirely dependent on his massive corporate salary. "Jocelyn is a homebody," Preston announced in English, noticing Diego staring at my collarbone with undisguised hunger. "She has a cute little digital art hobby. It keeps her busy at the brownstone while I handle the real work, the heavy lifting." I opened my mouth to ask the waiter for a slice of lemon, but Preston instantly raised his hand, cutting me off. "My wife will just have tap water," he instructed the waiter sharply without even looking at me. He turned back to Diego and chuckled, leaning in close. "You have to manage their expectations right. If I do not control the budget, she would spend my entire annual bonus on drawing tablets and colored pencils. She relies on me for everything." I take care of her so she does not have to worry her pretty little head about adult problems or complex finances. I forced down a bite of my filet mignon, letting the rich flavor ground me in reality. Preston was painting me as a financial burden, a delicate charity case he graciously supported. He had spent our entire marriage making me feel small, making sure his wealthy status-obsessed family knew he was the sole provider. His mother Sylvia constantly reminded me that I brought no assets to their pristine bloodline. Preston loved the power dynamic. He loved being the savior. What he did not know, what absolutely no one in his elite circle knew, was that my cute little digital art hobby had evolved into a massive corporation. 6 years ago, using a small private endowment from my late grandfather, I founded a digital education and 3D animation company. I worked under a corporate holding name, quietly building a media empire that now held the licensing rights to the most successful children's platforms in North America. I was secretly running a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I kept my name entirely off the public records to protect my peace from Preston and his greedy, manipulative family. I let them believe I was making pennies doing freelance graphic design because it kept them from digging into my accounts. If Preston or Sylvia knew the true scale of my wealth, they would have drained my accounts to fund their lavish parties and prop up his failing business ventures. Keeping my identity a secret was the ultimate shield against their endless greed. Diego nodded slowly, his dark eyes raking over my body with disgusting entitlement. He clearly accepted Preston's twisted down payment. Underneath the heavy white tablecloth, I felt Diego's gaze burning through the silk of my dress. He was testing the waters, waiting for me to pull away or look at my husband for help. I looked at Preston. He took a long sip of his wine, deliberately looking away at the restaurant wall, silently sanctioning the assault to save his failing hedge fund. He was willing to throw me to the wolves to save his own skin. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal solidified into absolute clarity. I was done playing the quiet wife. I was done hiding my strength to protect the fragile ego of a pathetic man. I placed my linen napkin neatly on the table, preparing to show both of these arrogant men exactly who they were dealing with. 1 month later, the stifling air of the Manhattan elite felt like a distant nightmare. I stood on the expansive wrap-around terrace of my newly purchased penthouse in Wicker Park. Leaving New York City was the easiest and most liberating decision I had ever made. I wanted to put 1,000 miles between myself and the toxic, suffocating ruins of my previous life. Chicago offered a vibrant, grounded, creative energy that perfectly matched the next phase of Lingo Smile Media. This penthouse, with its exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and sweeping views of the city skyline, was the ultimate sanctuary I had built entirely on my own terms. The warm summer breeze carried the sound of genuine laughter across the terrace. There were no crystal chandeliers or stiff, formal dining arrangements tonight. Instead, strands of warm, golden lights hung above a massive, custom-built cedar dining table. The scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs filled the air from the private chef I had hired to prepare a family-style Italian feast. This was not a gathering designed to impress venture capitalists or project an illusion of old money wealth. This was a private celebration with the only people who truly mattered. I looked down the length of the table, and my heart swelled with a profound sense of peace. My sister Beatrice sat next to her husband Kendrick. Watching Kendrick tonight was a revelation. In Manhattan, he always had to wear his corporate armor, constantly navigating the subtle racist condescension and elite arrogance of my husband's family. Here on my terrace, that armor was completely gone. The brilliant African-American defense attorney was leaning back in his chair, laughing openly at a joke, pouring wine for his wife, and looking entirely at home. He was not an outsider here. He was the fiercely protective brother who had helped me burn a fraudulent empire to the ground. Seated across from them were the brilliant minds who had helped me build Lingo Smile Media from the ground up. Elias, my lead 3D animator, and Tara, the head of our digital curriculum department, were sharing a massive plate of handmade pasta. They were the ones who had sat with me in cramped coffee shops 6 years ago, reviewing my initial sketches and believing in my vision long before the company was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They knew the quiet, struggling artist, and they respected the chief executive officer. The contrast between this dinner and the excruciating events of the past 6 years was absolute night and day. There was nobody at this table monitoring the price of the wine we were drinking. Nobody was making subtle, degrading comments about my background or demanding that I prove my worth through submission. I was not playing the role of a financial parasite to make a weak man feel powerful. I was surrounded by a chosen family, built on authentic connection, mutual respect, and shared growth. Kendrick picked up his glass of red wine and tapped the side with his fork. The clear, ringing sound cut through the lively chatter, and the table gradually fell into a comfortable, expectant silence. Kendrick stood up, his tall frame commanding the space with a warm, powerful presence. "I want to make a toast." Kendrick began, looking directly at me with eyes full of immense pride. Over the past month, we have all watched the public collapse of a man who built his entire life on lies, greed, and the exploitation of others. We watched a family that valued status over human dignity lose absolutely everything because they mistook cruelty for strength. Kendrick raised his glass slightly higher. "But we are not here tonight to celebrate their destruction. We are here to celebrate the woman who walked through their fire and emerged holding the deed to the entire city." Elias and Tara smiled, raising their glasses in agreement. Beatrice reached out and gently squeezed my hand from across the table, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Jocelyn Kendrick continued, his deep voice carrying across the quiet terrace. "You spent years confined in a space that tried to convince you that you were small. They looked at your brilliance and tried to call it a hobby. They looked at your kindness and tried to use it as a weapon against you. But you never let their toxic metrics define your reality. You quietly built an empire while they were busy building a house of cards. You proved that true power does not need to shout. It does not need to belittle others to stand tall. True power protects its own and builds tables exactly like this one, where everyone is respected and nobody is ever treated as an outsider." He looked around the table, acknowledging every person sitting under the warm string lights. "This is what real wealth looks like," Kendrick concluded. "It is not offshore accounts or stolen hedge funds. It is the ability to choose your family, to protect your peace, and to thrive entirely on your own terms." To Jocelyn, the true architect of her own destiny. To Jocelyn, the table echoed in unison, raising their glasses toward the Chicago skyline. I took a sip of my wine, letting the rich flavor and the absolute sincerity of their words wash over me. I looked at the faces of my sister, my brilliant brother-in-law, and my fiercely loyal creative team. Preston and Sylvia had spent years trying to convince me that family meant blind loyalty to a corrupt bloodline. They believed that duty required accepting abuse in exchange for financial security. They were completely wrong. Family was not an obligation you were born into or a trap you married into. Family was a conscious daily choice. It was the people who stood by you in the darkest hours, who fiercely defended your dignity, and who celebrated your strength without ever feeling threatened by it. I set my glass down on the cedar table and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. The toxic ghosts of the Manhattan brownstone, the sting of Sylvia's slap, and the disgusting memory of the Michelin-starred restaurant were entirely washed away. I was sitting at the head of my own table, surrounded by my own chosen pack, and the air had never tasted so incredibly sweet. The warm summer breeze carried the sound of clinking glasses and joyous laughter from the cedar dining table behind me. I stepped away from the lively conversation and walked to the edge of the wraparound terrace. My hands rested on the cool glass railing as I looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city was a sea of glittering lights stretching out into the dark horizon. It was a beautiful night, but the real spectacle was just about to begin. I checked my luxury watch. It was exactly 9 o'clock. As if on cue, the massive digital billboards across the bustling downtown district suddenly shifted their displays. The generic advertisements for luxury cars and high-end fashion brands vanished completely. In their place, vibrant bursts of color illuminated the night sky. The highly anticipated premiere of Lingo Smile Media's newest global animation series was officially launching on screens across the country and around the world. I watched as the bright, intelligent characters I had carefully designed in the quiet, lonely hours of the night now smiled down at millions of viewers. My educational platform was teaching children in over 50 countries, bridging language gaps and sparking imaginations on a global scale. I reached into the pocket of my silk jacket and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook. The cover was scuffed, and the pages were slightly yellowed with age. I opened it to the very first page. Staring back at me were the original pencil sketches of the characters currently lighting up the city. I ran my fingertips over the faded graphite lines. I vividly remembered the night I drew them. I had been sitting on the floor of the Manhattan brownstone, working quietly, while Preston complained endlessly about his failing hedge fund. He had snatched this exact notebook from my hands and tossed it across the room. He told me to stop wasting my time on useless child's play and focus on being a presentable corporate wife. He called my imagination a pathetic escape from the real world he generously financed. My phone vibrated heavily in my pocket, pulling me from the memory. I slid the device out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an urgent breaking news alert from a premier financial network. I tapped the notification and read the headline: Former Manhattan financial director sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. I opened the full article and read the details with a calm, steady heartbeat. The federal judge had shown absolutely no leniency. Preston had been convicted on all counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The article detailed how he wept openly in the courtroom, collapsing at the defense table as the judge handed down the maximum possible sentence without the possibility of early parole. He was going to spend the next 2 decades behind bars in a maximum security facility, stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his arrogant delusions of grandeur. The financial fallout for his family was equally absolute and utterly devastating. The Securities and Exchange Commission had authorized the complete and total liquidation of every single asset tied to the family name to pay restitution to the defrauded investors. The offshore shell accounts had been frozen and seized by federal authorities. The fleet of luxury cars had been auctioned off. And the pristine Hamptons estate, the ultimate crown jewel of Sylvia's social dynasty, had been officially sold by my holding corporation to a commercial developer who planned to tear it down and build a public resort. According to the investigative report, Sylvia was now living in a tiny, cramped apartment in a neighborhood she would have previously refused to even drive through. Her wealthy, influential friends had completely abandoned her, blocking her phone number and permanently banning her from their elite country clubs. The Manhattan high society she had worshipped had erased her existence overnight. She had spent her entire life judging people by their net worth and treating outsiders like parasites. Now she was completely bankrupt, socially isolated, and forced to live the exact life she had ruthlessly mocked for decades. I locked my phone screen and slid it back into my pocket. I did not feel the need to gloat. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I just felt a profound, grounding sense of closure. The scales of justice had finally balanced perfectly. I looked down at the leather notebook in my hands one last time. Preston had tried to use a draconian prenuptial agreement to leave me destitute in the freezing rain. He had tried to trade my physical dignity to cover up his federal crimes. He thought he was the sole architect of my survival. He never understood that his blinding arrogance was the exact mechanism that shielded my wealth. His desperate need for financial control had provided the airtight legal firewall that protected my $70 million trust and my massive media empire from his catastrophic ruin. I closed the notebook with a soft, definitive snap. I had achieved absolute financial independence. I had fiercely protected my legal rights against a family of corporate predators. I had built a creative empire entirely on my own terms without ever compromising my integrity or my vision. I was no longer the quiet, submissive girl shrinking under the weight of someone else's toxic expectations. I was the chief executive officer of my own destiny. I turned my head slightly, looking back over my shoulder at the dining table. Kendrick was pouring another glass of vintage red wine for my sister Beatrice. Elias and Tara were laughing loudly at a shared joke, their faces glowing under the warm string lights. They were my chosen family, a brilliant, loyal circle of people who celebrated my strength and honored my authentic self. They were waiting for me. There are men who think they can throw you to the wolves to save their own skin. They never realize that some women are born to lead the pack. I slipped the notebook back into my pocket, lifted my chin, and walked away from the edge of the terrace. I walked back toward the warmth of the lights and the sound of genuine laughter, completely free, whole, and victorious. The most profound lesson from Vanessa's journey is that true power never needs to shout. For years, she endured financial manipulation in silence, allowing her arrogant husband to mistake her patience for weakness. Yet she used that very underestimation as a shield to quietly build a vibrant 3D animation empire. Her story teaches us that absolute independence is our greatest armor against betrayal. When we invest in our passions and enforce strict boundaries, we become the fearless architects of our own destinies. Please share your own experience of turning underestimation into your ultimate success, and be sure to comment below.